Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Tonight, we'll explore disturbing stories of doctors and nurses whose patients expected a cure but instead found death. A grim reminder that evil can hide behind a stethoscope and a smile. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. In the quiet corridors of hospitals across New Jersey and Pennsylvania, where the steady beep of heart monitors creates a lullaby for the sick and healing, there walked a man whose presence brought not comfort, but death. His name was Charles Edmund Cullen, and for 16 long years, he moved like a shadow through the healthcare system, carrying with him a darkness that would claim the lives of dozens, possibly hundreds, of innocent people. This is a story that will chill you to the bone, not because of its brutality, but because of its quiet, methodical nature. It's the story of how someone entrusted with healing became an agent of death, and how the very system designed to protect patients enabled one of America's most prolific serial killers to operate undetected for over a decade and a half. Charles Cullen was born on February 22, 1960, in West Orange, New Jersey, into a world that seemed destined to shape him into something sinister. He was the youngest of 8 children in a Catholic family, but his childhood was far from the warm, nurturing environment one might expect. When Charles was just 7 months old, his father died in a bus accident, leaving his mother to raise 8 children alone. The Cullen household was chaotic, filled with the constant stress of poverty and loss. His mother struggled with mental health issues, and the family dynamics were dysfunctional at best. Charles would later describe his childhood as lonely and traumatic, marked by feelings of abandonment and rejection. These early experiences planted the seeds of what would later become a twisted psychology. As a young boy, Charles was withdrawn and antisocial. His classmates remember him as strange and detached, someone who seemed to exist on the periphery of normal social interactions. He was intelligent but brooding, often lost in his own dark thoughts. Teachers noticed his peculiar behavior but attributed it to his difficult home life rather than recognizing the warning signs of something far more sinister developing within him. During his teenage years, Charles's behavior became increasingly concerning. He would later admit to investigators that he had thoughts of suicide and violence from an early age. In high school, he attempted suicide multiple times, displaying a pattern of self-destructive behavior that would continue throughout his life. These attempts weren't cries for help in the traditional sense, they were manifestations of a deeply disturbed mind grappling with impulses he couldn't understand or control. After graduating from high school, Charles briefly attended a few colleges but never completed his education. He drifted aimlessly for several years, working various odd jobs and struggling with depression and suicidal ideation. It was during this period that he made a decision that would prove fateful for countless innocent victims. He decided to become a nurse. In 1984, at the age of 24, Charles Cullen enrolled in the Mountainside School of Nursing in Mountainside, New Jersey. To those around him, this seemed like a positive step, a troubled young man finally finding direction in life through a profession dedicated to healing and caring for others. His instructors noted that he was competent, even skilled in his studies, though they also observed that he remained socially isolated and emotionally distant from his peers. What they couldn't see was the dark satisfaction Charles derived from being around sick and dying people. While other nursing students struggled with the emotional weight of witnessing human suffering, Charles seemed oddly at peace in these environments. He was drawn to the intensive care units and critical care areas where patients were most vulnerable, most dependent on the very people meant to save them. Charles graduated from nursing school in 1987 and immediately began working as a registered nurse. His first position was at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey, where he worked the night shift in the burn unit. Night shifts appealed to him because there was less supervision, fewer witnesses to his activities, and more opportunities to be alone with patients. It was here, in the sterile halls of St. Barnabas, that Charles Cullen would claim his first victim and begin a killing spree that would span nearly 2 decades. The year was 1988, just 1 year after Charles had begun his nursing career. Judge John Yengo, a 72-year-old patient recovering from surgery, was admitted to the burn unit where Charles worked. Judge Yengo was making good progress in his recovery when, suddenly, his condition took a dramatic turn for the worse. His heart began to race uncontrollably, and despite the best efforts of the medical team, he died unexpectedly. The death was attributed to complications from his injuries and advanced age. No one suspected that Charles Cullen had deliberately administered a fatal dose of medication that caused the judge's heart to go into fatal arrhythmia. It was a perfect crime, the method was sophisticated enough to appear natural, and Charles had chosen a victim whose death wouldn't raise immediate suspicions. What Charles felt in that moment, watching Judge Yengo die, was intoxicating. Years later, he would describe it to investigators as a sense of power and control that he had never experienced before. He had held a human life in his hands and had chosen to extinguish it. For someone who had felt powerless his entire life, this newfound ability to determine who lived and who died was addictive. But Judge Yengo's death was just the beginning. Over the following months, Charles began to experiment with different methods and different victims. He discovered that certain medications, when administered to patients who weren't prescribed them, could cause deaths that appeared natural. Digoxin, a heart medication, became one of his preferred weapons. When given to patients who didn't need it, digoxin could cause fatal heart arrhythmias that would be difficult to detect without specific testing. Insulin was another favorite tool. When injected into patients who weren't diabetic, insulin would cause their blood sugar to drop to dangerously low levels, leading to coma and death. The beauty of these methods, from Charles's twisted perspective, was that they were virtually undetectable unless someone specifically looked for them, and why would they? These were sick patients in a hospital setting where deaths, while always tragic, were not uncommon. As Charles continued his killing spree at St. Barnabas, a disturbing pattern began to emerge, though it would be years before anyone would recognize it. Patients under his care seemed to die at unusual rates, often during the night shift when Charles was on duty. However, because hospitals are places where people routinely die, and because Charles was careful to choose victims whose deaths wouldn't immediately raise suspicions, these early murders went undetected. Charles's methods were becoming more refined with each kill. He learned to access medications through the hospital's automated dispensing system, known as Pyxis machines, by entering the information of patients who were legitimately prescribed certain drugs, then taking those drugs and using them on different patients. This created a paper trail that led away from his actual victims, making it nearly impossible for investigators to later piece together his crimes. He also became adept at reading the rhythms of the hospital. He knew which nurses were most observant, which doctors asked the most questions, and which times of day offered the greatest opportunities for his deadly work. Charles was methodical and patient, never acting impulsively, always calculating the risks and benefits of each potential murder. But despite his careful planning, there were those who began to notice something strange about Charles. His colleagues observed that he seemed unusually calm around dying patients, showing none of the emotional distress that typically affected healthcare workers. Some noted that he volunteered for overtime shifts in units with critically ill patients, and that he seemed almost eager to be assigned to the most vulnerable cases. However, these observations were dismissed as personality quirks rather than warning signs. Charles was competent at his job, technically skilled, and always willing to work extra shifts, qualities that made him valuable to understaffed hospitals struggling to provide adequate care. After several years at St. Barnabas, Charles left his position in 1992. His departure followed a series of unusual patient deaths that had begun to raise some concerns among staff, though no formal investigation was launched. This would become Charles's pattern throughout his career. Whenever suspicions began to mount at one facility, he would simply move on to another hospital, where his clean references and needed skills would quickly get him hired. His next position was at Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg, New Jersey, where he worked in the coronary care unit. Warren Hospital was smaller than St. Barnabas, with fewer resources and less stringent oversight, perfect conditions for Charles to continue his deadly activities. Over the next year, he killed at least 5 patients at Warren, using the same methods he had perfected at his previous job. One of his victims at Warren was Helen Dean, an elderly woman who was recovering from cancer surgery. Before Helen died, she managed to tell her family members that a male nurse had given her an injection, after which she felt terrible pain and distress. When Helen died shortly after, her family was devastated but accepted the doctor's explanation that her death was due to complications from her cancer. It would be years before investigators would realize that Helen Dean's final words were actually a description of her murder. Charles's time at Warren Hospital ended abruptly in 1993 when he was found in a patient's room during a medication error incident. While the incident itself was relatively minor, it drew attention to Charles's activities in a way that made him uncomfortable. Rather than risk further scrutiny, he resigned and moved on to his next victim facility. This pattern of moving from hospital to hospital whenever questions arose was crucial to Charles's ability to continue killing for so many years. The healthcare industry, plagued by nursing shortages and high turnover rates, was eager to hire experienced nurses with good references. None of Charles's previous employers wanted to admit they might have had a problem with patient deaths on their watch, so they provided neutral or even positive references when Charles applied for new positions. In 1998, Charles secured a position at Lehigh Valley Hospital Cedar Crest in Allentown, Pennsylvania. This move across state lines gave him a fresh start and a new hunting ground for his deadly activities. Lehigh Valley was a large, busy hospital with multiple units and hundreds of patients, perfect camouflage for a serial killer who relied on anonymity and chaos to hide his crimes. At Lehigh Valley, Charles worked primarily in the cardiac care unit, where patients with heart conditions were treated. This gave him easy access to cardiac medications like digoxin, which had become his weapon of choice. Over the course of his employment there, which lasted until 2002, Charles would kill more patients than at any other single facility. His victims at Lehigh Valley included Stella Daniels, a 58-year-old woman who was recovering from heart surgery. Stella was making good progress and was expected to make a full recovery when Charles administered a fatal dose of digoxin during his night shift. Her death was attributed to complications from her surgery, and her family never suspected that their loved one had been murdered. Another victim was Matthew Mattern, a 21-year-old man who had been admitted for a relatively minor procedure. Matthew was young and healthy, with every expectation of a full recovery, when Charles decided to kill him with an overdose of pancuronium bromide, a paralytic drug. Matthew's death shocked everyone who knew him and devastated his family, who couldn't understand how someone so young and healthy could die so suddenly in a hospital. During his time at Lehigh Valley, Charles refined his methods even further. He learned to exploit weaknesses in the hospital's medication management system, finding ways to access drugs without creating obvious paper trails. He also became more selective about his victims, choosing patients whose deaths would be least likely to trigger investigations. But perhaps most chillingly, Charles began to take a more active role in the dying process. Rather than simply administering fatal doses and leaving, he would sometimes stay with his victims as they died, observing their final moments with what colleagues described as an eerie calm. Some nurses noticed that Charles seemed unusually interested in participating in code blue situations, where medical teams attempted to resuscitate dying patients. By 2002, Charles had been working at Lehigh Valley Hospital for 4 years, and his activities had begun to attract attention from some observant staff members. Several nurses had noticed that an unusually high number of patients seemed to die during Charles's shifts, and some had observed his strange behavior around dying patients. One nurse, in particular, had become suspicious of Charles's frequent requests to work in the cardiac care unit and his unusual familiarity with cardiac medications that weren't typically used in that unit. This nurse began keeping informal notes about unusual deaths and medication discrepancies that seemed to occur when Charles was on duty. However, when this nurse attempted to bring her concerns to hospital administrators, she was told that her suspicions were unfounded and that she should focus on her own work rather than making accusations against a colleague. The hospital's response reflected a systemic problem in healthcare, a reluctance to investigate potential wrongdoing by staff members, partly due to fear of liability and partly due to the difficulty of finding qualified replacements. Despite the lack of support from administration, the nurse continued to monitor Charles's activities. She began documenting medication errors, unusual patient deaths, and strange coincidences that seemed to occur whenever Charles was working. Her persistence would eventually play a crucial role in exposing Charles's crimes, though it would take several more years and many more deaths before justice would be served. Meanwhile, Charles seemed to sense that he was under increased scrutiny. His killing frequency decreased somewhat, and he became more cautious about his methods. However, his compulsion to kill remained strong, and he continued to take lives even as the walls began to close in around him. In early 2002, Charles left Lehigh Valley Hospital under circumstances that were never fully explained to his new employers. He quickly found a position at Somerset Medical Center in Somerville, New Jersey, where he would work for what would prove to be his final assignment as a nurse, and where his killing spree would finally come to an end. At Somerset Medical Center, Charles worked the night shift in the intensive care unit alongside a nurse named Amy Luffren. Amy was a single mother of 2 young children. Struggling with her own health issues, she suffered from cardiomyopathy, a serious heart condition that she was keeping secret from her employers for fear of losing her job and health insurance. Charles and Amy quickly developed what appeared to be a close friendship. Amy found Charles to be kind and supportive, someone who understood the pressures of working in critical care and who seemed to genuinely care about her well-being. Charles helped Amy cover for her condition when her symptoms flared up, and he often volunteered to take on extra responsibilities so she could rest when needed. What Amy didn't know was that Charles's kindness and helpfulness were part of his psychological profile. Many serial killers are capable of forming seemingly normal relationships and can appear caring and empathetic on the surface while harboring dark impulses beneath. Charles's friendship with Amy served multiple purposes. It provided him with emotional support and normalcy while also giving him an ally who could provide cover for his activities if needed. But Charles's presence at Somerset Medical Center quickly began to have the same deadly impact that had characterized his previous positions. Within months of his arrival, unusual patient deaths began occurring during his shifts, though the pattern was not immediately recognized by hospital staff. On June 28, 2003, a patient named Reverend Florian Gall was admitted to Somerset Medical Center for treatment of a stomach condition. Reverend Gall was 68 years old and in relatively good health despite his illness. His treatment plan was straightforward, and his prognosis was good. He was expected to recover fully and return home within a few days. During the night of June 28, Charles was assigned as Reverend Gall's nurse. In the early morning hours of June 29, the Reverend suddenly went into cardiac arrest. Despite aggressive resuscitation efforts, Reverend Gall died, shocking his family and the medical team who had expected him to recover. What made Reverend Gall's death particularly suspicious was that he had no history of heart problems, and his cardiac arrest appeared to be completely unexpected given his condition and treatment. However, it was the autopsy that would provide the first concrete evidence of Charles's criminal activities at Somerset Medical Center. The medical examiner found unexpectedly high levels of digoxin in Reverend Gall's system, a heart medication that he had never been prescribed and that had no legitimate medical reason for being in his body. This discovery prompted Somerset Medical Center to begin an internal investigation, and for the first time in Charles's long career, his activities came under formal scrutiny. The investigation revealed that Charles had accessed digoxin from the hospital's medication system multiple times on the night of Reverend Gall's death, despite having no legitimate medical reason to do so. Computer records showed that Charles had used his access codes to withdraw the medication, creating a clear trail linking him to the Reverend's death. But Reverend Gall was not Charles's only victim at Somerset Medical Center. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that several other patients had died unexpectedly during Charles's shifts, and many of these deaths shared similar characteristics: unexpected cardiac events in patients with no history of heart problems. The discovery of digoxin in Reverend Gall's system prompted Somerset Medical Center to contact law enforcement. Detectives Tim Braun and Danny Baldwin from the Somerset County Prosecutor's Office were assigned to investigate what appeared to be a possible murder case. The detectives faced a complex challenge. Unlike traditional murder cases, which typically involve obvious evidence of violence, this case required them to understand the intricacies of hospital medication systems, pharmacology, and medical procedures. They needed to determine not just whether Reverend Gall had been murdered, but also whether other patients might have been victims of the same perpetrator. As they began their investigation, the detectives discovered that Charles Cullen had a troubling employment history. They learned that he had worked at multiple hospitals over the years and that his departures from several facilities had coincided with unusual numbers of patient deaths. However, because no formal investigations had been conducted at these previous hospitals, there was no official record of suspicious activity. The detectives also learned that Charles had been flagged by computer systems at Somerset Medical Center for unusual medication access patterns. He had been withdrawing drugs like digoxin and insulin at rates far exceeding what would be expected for his patient assignments, and he had been accessing these medications during shifts when none of his assigned patients had been prescribed them. But building a criminal case against Charles would require more than just suspicious patterns and computer records. The detectives needed concrete evidence that he had deliberately administered lethal doses of medication to patients with the intent to kill them. This type of evidence would be difficult to obtain without catching Charles in the act or getting him to confess to his crimes. Recognizing that they needed inside help to build their case, detectives Braun and Baldwin approached Amy Luffren and asked for her assistance in their investigation. This put Amy in an incredibly difficult position. Charles was her friend and colleague, someone who had helped her through difficult times, but she was also a healthcare professional with an ethical obligation to protect patients. Amy was initially reluctant to believe that Charles could be capable of murder. The man she knew was gentle, kind, and seemed genuinely dedicated to patient care. However, as the detectives shared their evidence with her, Amy began to recall incidents that had seemed odd at the time but that she had dismissed or rationalized. She remembered times when Charles had been unusually interested in accessing certain medications, and instances when he had volunteered to care for patients who weren't originally assigned to him. She also recalled his strange calmness during medical emergencies and his apparent fascination with the process of death and dying. Despite her personal feelings, Amy agreed to help the investigation by monitoring Charles's activities and reporting anything suspicious to the detectives. This decision required tremendous courage, as Amy was risking not only her friendship with Charles but also potentially putting herself in danger if Charles discovered her cooperation with law enforcement. The detectives equipped Amy with recording devices and instructed her to try to engage Charles in conversations about patient deaths and his access to medications. They hoped that Charles might reveal information about his activities if he trusted Amy and felt comfortable talking to her about his work. Over the course of several recorded conversations, Amy carefully probed Charles about his experiences working with critically ill patients and his thoughts about death and suffering. Initially, Charles was guarded and gave only vague responses about the emotional challenges of working in intensive care. However, as Amy continued to build rapport and express understanding for the psychological pressures of their work, Charles began to open up more. In one particularly chilling conversation, he spoke about feeling that some patients were suffering unnecessarily and that sometimes death could be seen as a mercy rather than a tragedy. When Amy asked more specific questions about medication errors and unusual patient deaths, Charles initially denied any involvement. However, his demeanor began to change, and Amy noticed that he seemed increasingly agitated and suspicious. She began to fear that Charles was becoming aware of her cooperation with investigators and that her safety might be at risk. The breakthrough came when Amy mentioned the computerized medication tracking system and how it kept detailed records of all drug access. Charles's response to this comment was revealing. He became visibly nervous and began making statements that suggested he was aware his medication access patterns had been unusual. In subsequent conversations, Charles began to make more direct admissions about his activities. He spoke about feeling compelled to help patients who were suffering, and he made statements that suggested he viewed himself as someone who was ending pain rather than causing harm. These recorded conversations provided investigators with crucial evidence of Charles's mindset and his acknowledgement of his role in patient deaths. On December 12, 2003, after months of investigation and with sufficient evidence to support charges, detectives Braun and Baldwin arrested Charles Cullen at his apartment. The arrest was conducted quietly to avoid alerting other potential victims or compromising the ongoing investigation into deaths at multiple hospitals. When confronted with the evidence against him, including the recorded conversations with Amy Luffren and the computer records showing his unauthorized access to lethal medications, Charles initially maintained his innocence. However, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of facing multiple murder charges, he eventually agreed to cooperate with investigators. Charles's confession was unlike anything investigators had encountered before. Rather than showing remorse for his actions, he spoke about his crimes in clinical, detached terms, as if discussing routine medical procedures rather than deliberate murders. He described his methods in detail, explaining how he had learned to exploit hospital medication systems and how he had chosen his victims. Most chilling of all was Charles's explanation for why he had killed. He claimed that he was motivated by compassion, that he was ending the suffering of patients who were in pain or who had poor prognosis. However, investigators quickly realized that many of his victims had been recovering well and had good chances of survival, contradicting his claims of mercy killing. As Charles continued to confess, the scope of his crimes became apparent. He admitted to killing patients not just at Somerset Medical Center, but at multiple hospitals throughout his career. The total number of victims was staggering. Charles confessed to killing 40 patients, though investigators believed the actual number could be much higher. As investigators worked to verify Charles's confessions and identify all of his victims, the true magnitude of his crimes began to emerge. Charles had worked at 9 different healthcare facilities over his 16-year career, and he had likely killed patients at each location. The investigation required coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, as well as cooperation from numerous hospitals and healthcare systems. Computer forensics specialists analyzed medication records from each facility where Charles had worked, looking for patterns of unusual drug access and correlating these patterns with unexpected patient deaths. This process revealed that Charles had been accessing lethal medications far more frequently than could be explained by legitimate patient care needs. Toxicology testing was ordered on the bodies of patients who had died during Charles's shifts at various hospitals, though many of these tests were inconclusive due to the time that had passed since the deaths. However, in cases where tissue samples were available, investigators found evidence of digoxin, insulin, and other drugs that had not been prescribed to the victims. The investigation also revealed the systematic failures that had allowed Charles to continue killing for so many years. Hospitals had failed to investigate unusual death patterns, medication tracking systems had not been properly monitored, and warning signs had been ignored or dismissed. Perhaps most troubling of all, when Charles had left previous positions under suspicious circumstances, his former employers had provided neutral or positive references rather than alerting new employers to potential problems. As the evidence mounted, it became clear that Charles Cullen was one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. His final victim count would ultimately be confirmed at 29 murders, though investigators believed he may have killed as many as 400 people during his career, a number that would make him the most deadly serial killer in U.S. history. As Charles underwent psychological evaluation and continued to provide details about his crimes, mental health professionals attempted to understand what had driven him to kill so many innocent people. His psychological profile revealed a complex individual whose motivations were far more sinister than his claims of mercy-killing suggested. Charles exhibited characteristics of an angel of death killer, healthcare workers who murder patients under their care. These killers often claim to be motivated by compassion or a desire to end suffering, but psychological analysis typically reveals deeper motivations related to power, control, and a desire for attention or recognition. In Charles's case, evaluations revealed that he derived satisfaction from having ultimate control over life and death. His choice to work night shifts, his preference for intensive care units, and his selection of vulnerable patients all suggested someone who was seeking opportunities to exercise this control with minimal risk of detection. The psychological evaluation also revealed that Charles had a history of depression, suicide attempts, and difficulty forming normal interpersonal relationships. His friendship with Amy Luffren appeared to be one of the few genuine emotional connections he had made in his adult life, which may explain why he had been willing to trust her with information about his activities. Perhaps most disturbing was Charles's apparent lack of genuine empathy for his victims. While he claimed to be motivated by compassion, his descriptions of the murders were cold and clinical, showing no emotional connection to the human suffering he had caused. This disconnect between his stated motivations and his actual emotional responses suggested a profound psychological disorder that had allowed him to kill repeatedly without experiencing normal guilt or remorse. Charles Cullen's case presented unique challenges for prosecutors in both New Jersey and Pennsylvania, where his crimes had been committed. The decision was made to focus initially on the cases where the evidence was strongest, while continuing to investigate other potential murders. In March 2004, Charles pled guilty to 13 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder in New Jersey. As part of his plea agreement, he agreed to cooperate with investigators and provide information about other potential victims at all the hospitals where he had worked. This cooperation was crucial for bringing closure to families who had lost loved ones and for identifying the full scope of his crimes. The sentencing proceedings were emotionally charged, with family members of Charles's victims providing impact statements describing the devastating effects of their losses. Many spoke about the betrayal of trust they felt. Their loved ones had been in the hospital to receive care and healing, not to become victims of a serial killer. In June 2004, Charles received 11 consecutive life sentences for his crimes in New Jersey, ensuring that he would never be eligible for parole. A few months later, he pled guilty to additional charges in Pennsylvania related to murders committed at Lehigh Valley Hospital and other facilities. He received additional life sentences, further guaranteeing that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. During the sentencing proceedings, Charles showed little emotion and offered only brief apologies to the families of his victims. His lack of genuine remorse was noted by observers and reinforced the psychological evaluation findings that he lacked normal empathy and emotional responses. The Charles Cullen case exposed serious weaknesses in healthcare security and patient safety systems that had allowed a serial killer to operate undetected for over a decade. In response to these revelations, hospitals across the country began implementing more stringent medication tracking systems, enhanced background check procedures, and better monitoring of unusual patient death patterns. New Jersey and Pennsylvania both passed legislation requiring hospitals to report suspicious deaths to state authorities and mandating more thorough investigations when unusual patterns of patient mortality are identified. These laws, sometimes referred to as Cullen laws, were designed to prevent similar cases from occurring in the future. The case also led to improvements in the way healthcare facilities handle employment references for departing staff members. New guidelines require employers to provide honest assessments of employee performance and to report any suspicions of misconduct to regulatory authorities, even if formal disciplinary action was not taken. Amy Luffren, whose courage in cooperating with investigators had been instrumental in stopping Charles's killing spree, faced her own challenges in the aftermath of the case. She struggled with guilt over not recognizing Charles's crimes earlier and with the trauma of learning that someone she had trusted and considered a friend had been a serial killer. She eventually left nursing and became an advocate for healthcare worker mental health and patient safety. The hospitals where Charles had worked faced numerous civil lawsuits from families of his victims. These legal proceedings resulted in millions of dollars in settlements and judgments, and several facilities made significant changes to their policies and procedures for monitoring staff and protecting patients. While much attention was focused on Charles Cullen and the systemic failures that enabled his crimes, it's important to remember that at the heart of this case were dozens of innocent victims whose lives were cut short by his actions. Each victim had a family, friends, and a life story that was ended prematurely by Charles's decision to kill. Reverend Florian Gall, whose death finally exposed Charles's crimes, was remembered by his congregation as a devoted minister who had spent his life serving others. His family took comfort in knowing that his death had led to the capture of a serial killer, potentially saving many other lives. Judge John Yengo, Charles's first confirmed victim, had served his community with distinction throughout his career and was looking forward to retirement when his life was ended. His family had no idea for 15 years that he had been murdered rather than dying from natural causes. Matthew Mattern, just 21 years old when he was killed at Lehigh Valley Hospital, had his entire life ahead of him. His death devastated his young wife and family, who had to live with the knowledge that he had been murdered by someone who was supposed to be caring for him. Each of Charles's victims represents not just a life lost, but also the ripple effects of grief and trauma that extended to their families, friends, and communities. The true cost of his crimes cannot be measured simply in numbers. It includes the immeasurable pain of those left behind and the loss of all the contributions these individuals might have made to the world. The Charles Cullen case serves as a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities that exist in healthcare systems and the importance of maintaining vigilance in protecting patient safety. Several key lessons emerged from this tragic case that continue to influence healthcare security and patient protection efforts today. First, the importance of robust medication tracking and monitoring systems cannot be overstated. Charles was able to access and misuse medications for years because the systems in place were not sophisticated enough to detect unusual patterns or to flag inappropriate access. Modern medication management systems now include more advanced monitoring capabilities and alert functions that can identify potential misuse. Second, the case highlighted the need for better communication between healthcare facilities when employees move from one institution to another. The practice of providing neutral references for employees who leave under questionable circumstances must be balanced against the responsibility to protect future patients and employers from potential harm. Third, the importance of taking seriously concerns raised by healthcare workers about unusual patterns or suspicious behavior cannot be ignored. In several instances, nurses and other staff members had noticed concerning patterns related to Charles's activities, but their concerns were not adequately investigated or addressed by hospital administration. Fourth, the case demonstrated the need for more comprehensive background checks and ongoing monitoring of healthcare workers who have access to vulnerable patients and dangerous medications. While most healthcare workers are dedicated professionals who would never harm a patient, the potential for abuse exists and must be guarded against through appropriate screening and oversight. Finally, the Charles Cullen case underscored the importance of creating a culture of patient safety in healthcare institutions, where unusual events are investigated thoroughly and where patient protection is prioritized over institutional reputation or convenience. Today, Charles Edmund Cullen is serving multiple consecutive life sentences at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton. He is confined to a maximum security facility where he spends most of his time in his cell, with limited contact with other inmates. His earliest possible parole date is not until the year 2388, effectively ensuring that he will spend the rest of his natural life in prison. Prison officials report that Charles has been a relatively compliant inmate who has not caused significant disciplinary problems during his incarceration. He has reportedly expressed interest in reading and has participated in some prison educational programs, though he has shown little interest in psychological counseling or treatment programs. Charles receives very few visitors and maintains minimal contact with the outside world. His family members have largely distanced themselves from him, and he has not maintained friendships or romantic relationships since his incarceration. In many ways, he has become as isolated in prison as he was emotionally isolated during his years of committing murder. Periodically, investigators from various jurisdictions contact Charles to ask about additional potential victims or to seek information about unsolved deaths that occurred during his career. He has generally been cooperative with these inquiries, though his memory of specific incidents has become less reliable over time. The case continues to be studied by criminologists, healthcare security experts, and law enforcement professionals who are working to prevent similar crimes from occurring in the future. Charles Cullen's name has become synonymous with healthcare serial killing, and his case is frequently cited in discussions about patient safety and healthcare worker screening. As we reach the end of this dark journey through the crimes of Charles Cullen, we're left with more questions than answers. How does someone who becomes a nurse, a profession dedicated to healing and caring, transform into one of America's most prolific serial killers? What drives a person to look into the eyes of vulnerable, trusting patients and choose to end their lives? The psychological evaluations and interviews with Charles have provided some insights, but they cannot fully explain the depth of evil that allowed him to kill again and again for 16 years. Perhaps some aspects of human darkness are simply beyond our understanding, representing a level of moral corruption that defies explanation or comprehension. What we can understand is the importance of remaining vigilant, of taking seriously the concerns of those who notice unusual patterns or suspicious behavior, and of never becoming so comfortable with our systems that we forget their vulnerabilities. The Charles Cullen case teaches us that evil can operate in plain sight, hiding behind professional competence and apparent caring. His story also reminds us of the courage required to do the right thing when faced with difficult circumstances. Amy Luffren risked her career, her safety, and her emotional well-being to help investigators stop a serial killer. The nurses and other healthcare workers who eventually came forward with their suspicions showed bravery in speaking out against someone they had worked alongside for years. In the quiet corridors of hospitals tonight, nurses are caring for vulnerable patients, administering medications, and providing comfort to those who are sick and frightened. The vast majority of these healthcare workers are heroes who have dedicated their lives to healing and helping others. But the shadow of Charles Cullen serves as a constant reminder that we must never take this trust for granted, and that protecting the vulnerable requires eternal vigilance from all of us. The beeping of monitors, the soft footsteps in hospital hallways, the gentle voices of nurses checking on patients, these sounds that once seemed purely comforting now carry with them the memory of Charles Cullen and the knowledge that evil can wear a nurse's uniform. It's a sobering thought as we drift off to sleep, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, in hospitals across the country, patients are placing their lives in the hands of strangers, trusting that those who care for them will do no harm. Charles Edmund Cullen will spend the rest of his life behind bars, but his legacy lives on in the systems that have been changed, the laws that have been passed, and the families who will never forget the loved ones he stole from them. His story serves as both a warning and a call to action, a reminder that protecting the innocent requires vigilance, courage, and an unwavering commitment to justice. In the end, the most fitting tribute to Charles Cullen's victims may be the improvements in patient safety that their deaths helped bring about. If the lessons learned from this tragedy prevent even one future victim, then perhaps some meaning can be found in these senseless losses. But for now, as the night grows quiet and the world settles into sleep, we remember those who trusted a nurse named Charles Cullen and never woke up to see another day. Please, if you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we explore true crime stories in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, we journey into one of the most disturbing cases in modern British criminal history, the chilling crimes of Lucy Letby, a neonatal nurse whose trusted position became the instrument of unthinkable tragedy. So, we'll explore this complex case that shook the United Kingdom and raised profound questions about trust, medical safety, and the darkest corners of human nature. This is a story that unfolded over years, involving dedicated doctors who fought to be heard, hospital administrators who failed to act, and ultimately, a justice system that would deliver one of the harshest sentences in British legal history. Lucy Letby was born on January 4, 1990, in the quiet town of Hereford, England. From an early age, she seemed destined for a career in healthcare. Those who knew her during her formative years described a young woman who possessed what appeared to be genuine care for others, particularly children and infants. Letby got an appointment as a registered nurse at the Countess of Chester Hospital and started working in the neonatal unit from January 2, 2012. She had found her calling, or so it seemed, in one of medicine's most delicate specialties, caring for the most vulnerable patients imaginable, premature and critically ill newborn babies. The neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital was a place where miracles and tragedies existed side by side. Here, babies who entered the world too early or with serious medical conditions fought for their lives with the help of advanced medical technology and the skilled hands of nurses like Letby. For the first few years of her career, Letby appeared to be exactly what you would expect from a dedicated neonatal nurse. She worked long shifts, showed up reliably, and seemed to genuinely care about the tiny patients in her charge. She lived a normal life living in several rented apartments until she bought a house near the hospital, a 20-minute walking distance from her ward. Yet beneath this exterior of professional competence and apparent dedication, something darker was taking root. Looking back through the lens of what we now know, certain warning signs were present even during her training years. After gaining her nursing pin, Letby started working in the neonatal unit at Countess of Chester, but her path to that position hadn't been entirely smooth. During her student nursing placement, Letby had initially struggled. Reports later emerged that she had been described as somewhat cold and detached during her training. She had even failed her final student placement initially, requiring additional supervision and assessment before being deemed competent to practice independently. These early warning signs, however, were either overlooked or dismissed as the normal struggles of a student nurse finding her footing in a demanding profession. The healthcare system, stretched thin and always in need of qualified nurses, was perhaps too willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. As Letby settled into her role in the neonatal unit, she began to establish herself as a reliable member of the nursing staff. She took on additional responsibilities, worked overtime when needed, and seemed to integrate well with her colleagues. To outside observers, she appeared to be thriving in her chosen profession. The period between June 2015 and June 2016 would later be identified as the timeframe during which Lucy Letby South crimes took place. Over the course of a year, between June 2015 and June 2016, Letby targeted sick newborns in the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital in northwest England. It began subtly at first, an increase in unexpected deaths and serious medical emergencies on the neonatal unit. In a department where life and death decisions are made daily, where premature babies fight against tremendous odds, a certain level of mortality is unfortunately expected. However, what was happening at the Countess of Chester Hospital was different. The babies who were being affected weren't always the sickest ones. Some had been making good progress, showing signs of improvement, when they would suddenly take catastrophic turns for the worse. Others would experience unexplained collapses that seemed to come out of nowhere. Dr. Stephen Breyer, the lead consultant on the neonatal unit, began to notice the pattern first. He observed that these unexpected incidents seemed to occur more frequently when certain staff members were on duty. As he looked more closely at the data, one name kept appearing in the duty rosters during these tragic events: Lucy Letby. The methods Letby employed were as varied as they were sinister. The prosecution was able to present evidence of Letby using various methods to attack babies, including injecting air into their bloodstreams and intravenous lines, force-feeding infants with milk or fluids, injecting insulin to induce hypoglycemia, and interfering with breathing tubes. One of the most disturbing aspects of Letby's crimes was her apparent ability to harm these vulnerable infants while maintaining the facade of a caring nurse. In some instances, she would be the one to discover a baby in distress and raise the alarm. She would then participate in the resuscitation efforts, sometimes even comforting the parents afterward. The case of Child A, one of her first victims, exemplifies the calculated nature of her crimes. This premature baby boy was making good progress when Letby injected air into his bloodstream through his central venous catheter. The air embolism traveled to his heart, causing a cardiac arrest. Despite desperate attempts by the medical team to save him, Child A died. What makes this case particularly chilling is that Letby was present during the resuscitation attempts. She watched as doctors and nurses fought to save the life of a baby she had deliberately harmed. She even sent a sympathy card to the parents afterward, expressing her condolences for their loss. Another victim, Child C, was one of a set of triplets. All three babies had been doing well, but when Letby was assigned to care for them, tragedy struck. She injected air into Child C's stomach and bloodstream, causing him to suffer a fatal air embolism. The baby's skin took on a distinctive purple discoloration, something that would become a recurring feature in many of Letby's victims. As the number of unexplained deaths and collapses continued to mount, several doctors on the neonatal unit began to voice their concerns more loudly. Dr. Breyer, along with several of his colleagues, noticed that the incident seemed to cluster around Letby's shifts. They began to document their observations more carefully, keeping track of which staff members were present during each incident. The pattern became increasingly clear, but it was still almost impossible to believe. How could a trained nurse, someone who had dedicated her career to saving lives, be deliberately harming the most vulnerable patients? The doctors' concerns grew more urgent when they realized that some of the medical emergencies they were witnessing had unusual characteristics. Babies would suffer from mysterious collapses that didn't follow typical patterns of neonatal illness. Some would have unexplained bleeding, others would show signs of poisoning with insulin, and still others would suffer from air embolisms, all conditions that could be artificially induced. Dr. Ravi Jairam, another consultant on the unit, became increasingly convinced that something was seriously wrong. He began to pay closer attention to the circumstances surrounding each incident, and he noticed that Letby often seemed to be in the right place at the right time to discover babies in distress. In one particularly telling incident, Dr. Jairam walked into a room to find a very premature baby in distress while Letby stood nearby, making no effort to help or raise an alarm. Our case included direct evidence from a doctor who walked into the nursery to find a very premature baby desaturating with Letby standing by, taking no action to help or to raise the alarm. She had deliberately dislodged the breathing tube. The doctors began to discuss their concerns among themselves, but they faced a difficult situation. Accusing a colleague of deliberately harming patients was an extraordinary allegation that would require extraordinary evidence. They needed to be absolutely certain before making such serious accusations. Meanwhile, Letby continued to work on the unit, apparently oblivious to the growing suspicion around her. Or perhaps she was aware but confident that her colleagues would never believe such accusations against a seemingly dedicated nurse. As the doctor's concerns became more vocal, they began to approach hospital management with their suspicions. This marked the beginning of what would become one of the most criticized aspects of the entire case, the hospital administration's response to the allegations. Rather than immediately investigating the doctor's concerns or temporarily removing Letby from patient care while an investigation was conducted, the hospital initially seemed more concerned about the potential reputational damage such allegations might cause. The doctors were told that their concerns were noted, but no immediate action was taken. This delay would prove to be tragically costly, as Letby continued to work on the neonatal unit for months after the initial concerns were raised. Hospital executives seemed reluctant to believe that one of their nurses could be capable of such horrific crimes. They requested more evidence, more documentation, more proof before they would take action. In the meantime, vulnerable babies remained in Letby's care. The doctor's frustration grew as their concerns were repeatedly dismissed or minimized. They were told that correlation didn't equal causation, that the pattern they were seeing could be explained by coincidence or by the natural variations in patient acuity that occur in any medical unit. Some hospital administrators even suggested that the doctors were being unfair to Letby, that they were looking for a scapegoat for the unit's higher-than-average mortality rates. This suggestion was particularly galling to the physicians, who were genuinely concerned about patient safety and were trying to protect the babies in their care. The situation became increasingly tense as the doctors continued to press for action while hospital management continued to hesitate. Medical staff morale began to suffer as healthcare professionals felt that their patient safety concerns were not being taken seriously. Finally, after months of pressure from the medical staff, the hospital agreed to conduct an internal review. However, even this review was limited in scope and did not immediately result in Letby being removed from patient care duties. It wasn't until the pressure became overwhelming, and the doctors threatened to escalate their concerns outside the hospital, that management finally took more decisive action. Letby was eventually moved away from direct patient care, but even then, she wasn't immediately dismissed or suspended. When they were unable to find a medical explanation, police were alerted and an investigation followed. The decision to involve law enforcement was not taken lightly, but it marked a crucial turning point in the case. Letby, now aged 33, was first arrested in July 2018. The arrest came as a shock to many of her colleagues and to the local community. How could someone who had chosen a profession dedicated to saving lives be accused of taking them instead? The police investigation was complex and painstaking. Detectives had to examine hundreds of medical records, interview dozens of witnesses, and consult with medical experts to understand the technical aspects of neonatal care. They needed to determine not only whether crimes had been committed, but also exactly how they had been carried out. One of the challenges investigators faced was the sophisticated nature of the alleged crimes. Letby hadn't used obvious methods like suffocation or physical violence. Instead, she had used her medical knowledge to harm babies in ways that could potentially be mistaken for natural complications of prematurity or illness. The investigation involved analyzing medical records going back several years, looking for patterns in patient outcomes, staffing schedules, and clinical presentations. Forensic accountants were brought in to create detailed timelines showing exactly when incidents occurred and which staff members were present. Medical experts were consulted to help investigators understand the significance of various clinical findings. They explained how air embolisms could be artificially induced, how insulin could be used to poison infants, and how interference with medical equipment could cause life-threatening complications. During this time, Letby was released on bail but was prohibited from working in any healthcare setting. The investigation continued for more than 2 years as police built their case piece by piece. The evidence that eventually emerged painted a picture of systematic abuse carried out over many months. Investigators found that Letby had used multiple methods to harm babies, often varying her approach to avoid detection. In some cases, she had injected air directly into babies' bloodstreams through their intravenous lines, causing fatal air embolisms. In others, she had administered unauthorized medications, including insulin, to cause life-threatening drops in blood sugar levels. Perhaps most disturbing of all, investigators discovered that Letby had sometimes interfered with babies' breathing equipment, either displacing breathing tubes or turning off alarms, putting the infants at immediate risk of respiratory failure. One of the most chilling aspects of the investigation was the discovery of certain personal items in Letby's possession. When police searched her home, they found that she had kept keepsakes related to some of her victims. Among the items found were sympathy cards that had been sent to families after their babies died. Letby had kept these cards, along with other mementos such as hospital lanyards and medical notes related to the cases. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that Letby had been searching for information about some of the families on social media. She had looked up the parents of her victims on Facebook and other platforms, apparently monitoring their grief and their lives in the aftermath of their losses. This behavior suggested a level of psychological investment in her crimes that went beyond mere opportunity or impulse. It indicated that Letby was not only harming these babies but was also deriving some form of satisfaction from the aftermath of her actions. The discovery of these items provided investigators with important evidence of Letby's involvement in the cases. More importantly, it offered a disturbing glimpse into her psychological state and her apparent lack of empathy for the families she had devastated. Forensic psychologists who examined the evidence suggested that this behavior was consistent with someone who derived psychological satisfaction from the power and control involved in taking lives and then observing the resulting grief and chaos. Letby, now aged 33, was first arrested in July 2018 and subsequently charged in November 2020. The delay between her arrest and the formal charges reflected the complexity of building a case against her. The trial that began in 2022 was one of the longest and most complex criminal trials in recent British history. After 9 months, on July 10, 2023, the jury are sent out to consider their verdicts. The length of the trial reflected both the number of charges against Letby and the technical complexity of the medical evidence. She pleads not guilty to 7 counts of murder, and 15 counts of attempted murder relating to 10 babies. Throughout the trial, Letby maintained her innocence, claiming that the deaths and injuries were the result of natural complications or systemic problems at the hospital. The prosecution presented a detailed case that included medical evidence, statistical analysis showing the correlation between Letby's presence and adverse events, and testimony from doctors who had witnessed her suspicious behavior. One of the key pieces of evidence was testimony from Dr. Jairam, who described finding Letby standing over a distressed baby without taking any action to help. This direct observation of suspicious behavior was crucial in establishing that Letby's actions were deliberate rather than accidental. The defense argued that the prosecution's case was based on coincidence and circumstantial evidence. They suggested that the correlation between Letby's presence and adverse events could be explained by other factors, such as her tendency to work extra shifts or to be assigned to care for the sickest babies. However, the prosecution was able to demonstrate that many of the babies who were harmed had not been among the sickest on the unit. Some had been making good progress when they suddenly deteriorated, which was inconsistent with natural disease progression. After 22 days of deliberation, a jury found Letby guilty on multiple counts. Lucy Letby is found guilty of 14 of 22 charges against her. The verdicts mark the end of one of the most disturbing criminal trials in British legal history. Lucy Letby was convicted in 2 trials in 2023 and 2024 of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 6 others in her care at the Countess of Chester Hospital in northwest England between 2015 and 2016. She is currently serving 15 whole life sentences for the murders. The sentence reflected the severity of her crimes and the vulnerability of her victims. Whole life sentences are reserved for the most serious cases where the court determines that the offender should never be released from prison. The judge, in delivering the sentence, noted the calculated nature of Letby's crimes and the breach of trust involved in her position as a healthcare professional. The vulnerability of her victims, premature and sick babies who were completely dependent on her care, was considered an aggravating factor that justified the harshest possible sentence. The impact of Letby's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The entire neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital was traumatized by the revelations. Colleagues who had worked alongside Letby for years struggled to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the reality of her crimes. The families of the victims faced not only the grief of losing their children but also the additional trauma of learning that these deaths were not natural tragedies but deliberate murders. Some families had previously found comfort in believing that their babies had died despite receiving the best possible care, only to discover that the very person entrusted with their care had been the cause of their deaths. The case also raised serious questions about the systems and processes in place to protect vulnerable patients in healthcare settings. The delays in investigating the doctor's concerns and the hospital administration's initial reluctance to take action became subjects of intense scrutiny. The Lucy Letby case exposed serious systemic failures in the way patient safety concerns are handled in healthcare settings. The doctors who first raised concerns about the pattern of deaths and injuries faced significant resistance from hospital administration. The British government commissioned an independent statutory inquiry into the circumstances surrounding the deaths, which began its hearings in September 2024. This inquiry, known as the Thirlwall Inquiry, was established to examine not only Letby's crimes but also the institutional failures that allowed them to continue for so long. The inquiry heard evidence about how hospital executives prioritized reputation management over patient safety. There were concerns that the hospital was more worried about potential negative publicity than about the possibility that patients were being harmed. One of the most troubling aspects of the case was the way whistleblowing healthcare professionals were treated. The doctors who raised concerns were sometimes portrayed as troublemakers or as being unfairly targeting a colleague. This response discouraged others from speaking up and allowed the situation to continue longer than it should have. The case highlighted the need for clearer protocols for investigating patient safety concerns, particularly when those concerns involve allegations of deliberate harm by healthcare staff. It also underscored the importance of creating a culture where staff feel safe to raise concerns without fear of retaliation or dismissal. The inquiry also examined the adequacy of background checks and ongoing monitoring of healthcare professionals. Questions were raised about whether existing systems are sufficient to detect individuals who might pose a risk to patients. Despite her conviction, the Lucy Letby case continues to generate controversy and debate. Ms. Letby's convictions followed a long-running, complex police investigation lasting several years and subsequent trials totaling almost 10 months, but some observers have raised questions about certain aspects of the case. Recently, a panel of 14 leading neonatologists and pediatricians concluded that there is no medical evidence supporting the claims of malfeasance related to her convictions. This development has added another layer of complexity to an already contentious case. A CCRC spokesperson said, "We are aware that there has been a great deal of speculation and commentary surrounding Lucy Letby's case. The Criminal Cases Review Commission has received an application to review her convictions. These developments have created a divide among medical professionals and legal experts. Some maintain that the evidence against Letby was overwhelming and that her convictions were sound. Others argue that the case relied too heavily on statistical evidence and that natural explanations for the deaths and injuries were not adequately considered. The controversy has been fueled by the technical complexity of the medical evidence and the difficulty that non-medical jurors might have had in understanding the intricacies of neonatal care. Some critics have suggested that the prosecution's case was based more on correlation than causation. However, supporters of the conviction point to the direct evidence of suspicious behavior witnessed by medical colleagues, as well as the variety of methods allegedly used by Letby to harm patients. They argue that the combination of statistical, medical, and observational evidence provided a compelling case for her guilt. The Lucy Letby case has had profound implications for healthcare practices in the United Kingdom and beyond. Hospitals have been forced to re-examine their policies and procedures for monitoring staff and investigating patient safety concerns. Many healthcare institutions have implemented new systems for tracking correlations between staff presence and adverse patient events. These systems use sophisticated data analysis to identify patterns that might otherwise go unnoticed. There has also been increased focus on creating cultures of openness and transparency where healthcare professionals feel comfortable raising concerns about patient safety. Training programs have been developed to help managers and administrators respond appropriately to such concerns. The case has highlighted the importance of robust background checking systems for healthcare workers. Some institutions have implemented more frequent monitoring and review processes to identify potential problems before they escalate. Professional nursing organizations have also responded to the case by reviewing their codes of conduct and ethical guidelines. There has been increased emphasis on the fundamental duty of care that nurses owe to their patients and the serious consequences of breaching that trust. Understanding how someone like Lucy Letby could commit such crimes has become a subject of intense interest for forensic psychologists and criminologists. The case presents a particularly challenging puzzle because it involves someone who chose a caring profession but then used that position to cause harm. Experts have noted that healthcare settings can unfortunately provide opportunities for individuals with malevolent intentions. The combination of access to vulnerable patients, medical knowledge, and the trust placed in healthcare professionals can create conditions that predators might exploit. Some psychologists have suggested that Letby might have been motivated by a desire for control and power over life and death. The neonatal intensive care unit, where the line between life and death is often razor thin, might have provided an irresistible environment for someone with such psychological needs. Others have pointed to the phenomenon known as angel of mercy killings, where healthcare workers harm patients and then either save them or appear to be the compassionate caregiver in the aftermath. However, Letby's case doesn't fit this pattern exactly, as she didn't typically attempt to resuscitate the babies she harmed. The psychological evaluation of Letby has been complicated by her consistent denial of the charges. She has never admitted to the crimes or provided insight into her motivations, making it difficult for experts to develop a complete understanding of her psychological profile. Behind every statistic and every charge in the Lucy Letby case was a family whose world was shattered. The parents of the babies who were murdered or injured have shown remarkable courage in speaking about their experiences and advocating for justice. Many of these families had initially found some comfort in believing that their babies had died despite receiving excellent medical care. The revelation that their children had been deliberately harmed by someone they trusted added an additional layer of trauma to their grief. Some parents spoke about how they had appreciated Letby's apparent compassion during their darkest moments, only to later learn that she was the cause of their suffering. This betrayal of trust was particularly devastating for families who were already dealing with the loss of a child. The families have also had to cope with the lengthy legal process, attending court hearings and reliving traumatic experiences through testimony and evidence. Many have spoken about the importance of seeing justice done, not only for their own children but to prevent similar tragedies from happening to other families. Despite their pain, many of the affected families have channeled their grief into advocacy for improved patient safety measures and better systems for protecting vulnerable patients in healthcare settings. The Lucy Letby case attracted intense media attention throughout the investigation and trials. The combination of vulnerable victims, a trusted professional turned predator, and systemic failures created a story that captured public attention and outrage. Media coverage of the case was extensive, with detailed reporting on the trial proceedings and the evidence presented. However, reporting restrictions during the trial limited what could be published until after the verdicts were delivered. The public response to the case was one of shock and horror. Many people struggled to understand how someone in a caring profession could commit such crimes against the most vulnerable patients. The case challenged public trust in healthcare institutions and professionals. Social media discussions about the case were intense and often emotional, with many people expressing anger not only at Letby but also at the hospital administrators who failed to act quickly on the doctor's concerns. The case also sparked broader discussions about patient safety, whistleblowing protections, and the systems in place to monitor healthcare professionals. Many people called for reforms to prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. While the Lucy Letby case occurred in the United Kingdom, its implications extend far beyond British borders. Healthcare systems around the world have taken note of the case and the lessons it offers about patient safety and professional oversight. The case has been studied by healthcare administrators and patient safety experts internationally as an example of how systematic failures can allow harmful individuals to continue practicing despite warning signs. Many countries have reviewed their own systems for monitoring healthcare professionals and investigating patient safety concerns in light of the Letby case. The importance of creating cultures where concerns can be raised and investigated promptly has been emphasized globally. The case has also contributed to international discussions about the psychological screening of healthcare workers and the need for ongoing monitoring throughout their careers. Professional organizations worldwide have used the case as a catalyst for reviewing their own ethical guidelines and disciplinary procedures. As our journey through the Lucy Letby case comes to an end, we're left with more questions than answers. How could someone entrusted with caring for the most vulnerable patients become their predator? How did systemic failures allow these crimes to continue for so long? And what can be done to prevent similar tragedies in the future? Letby has remained under investigation for further cases, suggesting that the full scope of her crimes may not yet be known. The ongoing inquiries and potential appeals mean that this case will continue to evolve and generate discussion for years to come. The legacy of the Lucy Letby case extends far beyond the courtroom verdicts. It has fundamentally changed how healthcare institutions think about patient safety, professional oversight, and the systems needed to protect vulnerable patients. For the families who lost their babies, no amount of reform or systemic change can bring back their children or undo their suffering. But their courage in speaking out and seeking justice has helped ensure that other families might be spared similar tragedies. The case serves as a stark reminder that even in places we consider safe, hospitals, schools, care homes, vigilance is necessary to protect the most vulnerable members of society. It underscores the importance of listening when concerns are raised and acting swiftly when patient safety is at stake. As we reflect on this disturbing chapter in criminal history, we're reminded of both the capacity for evil that can exist in unexpected places and the courage of those who speak out to protect others. The doctors who raised concerns despite institutional resistance, the investigators who painstakingly built the case, and the families who sought justice all played crucial roles in ensuring that the truth finally came to light. The story of Lucy Letby is one that will be studied and analyzed for years to come, not only as a criminal case but as a catalyst for change in healthcare systems around the world. It reminds us that the price of safety is eternal vigilance, and that protecting the most vulnerable among us requires systems, procedures, and above all, the courage to act when something is wrong. In the quiet corridors of neonatal units around the world, the shadows of this case serve as a reminder that trust, once broken, must be rebuilt through transparency, accountability, and an unwavering commitment to patient safety. The babies who lost their lives in this tragedy deserve nothing less than our collective commitment to ensuring that such horrors never happen again. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. In the quiet town of Woodstock, Ontario, families trusted their most vulnerable loved ones to the gentle care of nurses who had devoted their lives to healing. They placed their elderly parents and grandparents in long-term care facilities, believing they would receive compassion, dignity, and protection in their final years. For nearly a decade, this trust was betrayed in the most horrific way imaginable. Tonight, we delve into one of Canada's most disturbing cases of medical murder, the story of Elizabeth Wetlaufer, a registered nurse who systematically killed 8 elderly patients and attempted to murder 6 others using insulin injections. This isn't just a story about a killer who wore scrubs instead of a mask. It's a chilling examination of how institutional failures, warning signs ignored, and a broken system allowed a predator to operate in plain sight for years. Elizabeth May Wetlaufer was born in 1967, growing up in a world that seemed ordinary on the surface. She pursued nursing with what appeared to be noble intentions, a calling to care for those who couldn't care for themselves. She graduated from Conestoga College's nursing program and began her career in the healthcare system of southwestern Ontario. But beneath the professional exterior, something darker was brewing. Those who knew Wetlaufer described a woman struggling with personal demons that would eventually manifest in the most unthinkable ways. She battled alcohol dependency, a problem that would plague her throughout her nursing career. She had tumultuous relationships that left her feeling powerless and out of control. These weren't excuses for what would come, they were warning signs that a system designed to protect patients failed to recognize. As the years passed, Wettlaufer moved through various healthcare positions, carrying with her not just medical expertise, but an increasingly dangerous psychological state. She was stealing drugs from her workplace, a red flag that should have triggered immediate investigation. Instead, she continued to have access to vulnerable patients, night after night, shift after shift. What makes healthcare serial killers particularly terrifying is the inherent trust placed in them. Patients don't question when a nurse approaches with a syringe. Families don't suspect foul play when an elderly person passes away in what appears to be natural circumstances. This trust, this access, this authority, it became Elizabeth Wettlaufer's weapon of choice. The killing began sometime between June 25 and December 31, 2007, at the CalmingTrueCrimeAudio long-term facility in Woodstock, Ontario. Wettlaufer's first victim wasn't someone she killed outright. Instead, she committed what police would later classify as aggravated assault against 87-year-old Clotilde Adriano. Adriano was a vulnerable elderly woman, dependent on the care of those around her. One night, as she lay in her bed, trusting that the nurse approaching her was there to help, Wettlaufer injected her with insulin. Adriano survived this attack but died months later on July 30, 2008, though her death wasn't directly attributed to Wettlaufer's assault. This first attack established a pattern that would continue for years. Wettlaufer chose insulin as her weapon, a drug that, when administered improperly, could cause hypoglycemia, coma, and death. It was readily available in nursing homes, where many residents were diabetic. More insidiously, insulin overdoses could mimic natural medical emergencies, making detection extremely difficult. But why did she choose insulin? The answer reveals the calculated nature of these crimes. Insulin breaks down rapidly in the body, making it difficult to detect in post-mortem examinations. The symptoms of insulin overdose, confusion, weakness, unconsciousness, could easily be attributed to the natural decline of elderly patients. It was, in the minds of someone planning murder, the perfect poison. The most chilling aspect wasn't just the method, but the psychology behind it. This wasn't mercy killing, as later investigations would definitively establish. These weren't acts of compassion towards suffering patients. They were acts of power and control by someone who had found a way to hold the ultimate authority over human life. As 2008 progressed, Wettlaufer's confidence grew. She had successfully attacked her first victim without detection, and the system hadn't caught her. This emboldened her to continue, and the pace of her attacks began to accelerate. Between 2008 and 2009, while working at CalmingTrueCrimeAudio, she targeted 2 more victims in what would be classified as attempted murders. Michael Priddle and Wayne Hedges, both residents of the facility, became unwitting participants in Wettlaufer's deadly game. She administered insulin to both men, but they survived her attempts on their lives. What's particularly disturbing about this period is how Wettlaufer was able to continue operating. She was working night shifts, when staffing was lighter and oversight was minimal. She had legitimate access to medications, including insulin. And perhaps most importantly, no one suspected that a trusted healthcare provider could be systematically attacking patients. The failed attempts weren't deterrence, they were practice. Each unsuccessful murder taught Wettlaufer more about dosages, timing, and how to avoid detection. She was refining her method, becoming more efficient at killing. During this time, those around her began to notice behavioral changes. Her drinking problem was becoming more apparent. She was having relationship troubles. But these personal issues were seen as separate from her professional life. The idea that a nurse's personal problems could manifest in violence against patients wasn't something the system was designed to detect or prevent. August 11, 2011, marked a dark turning point. James Silcox, a 77-year-old resident of CalmingTrueCrimeAudio, became Wettlaufer's first confirmed murder victim. She approached his bedside during a night shift and administered a fatal dose of insulin. Silcox died that same day, his death appearing to be from natural causes. What makes this murder particularly haunting is the mundane nature of how it occurred. Silcox was sleeping peacefully when Wetlaufer entered his room. There was no struggle, no cry for help. He simply trusted the nurse who approached his bed, never knowing that her intentions were murderous. 6 days later, on August 17, 2011, Wetlaufer struck again. Maurice Granat, 84 years old and residing in the same facility, became her second murder victim. The proximity of these deaths, less than a week apart, shows how comfortable Wetlaufer had become with killing. She was operating with impunity, confident that no one would connect these deaths to her actions. The facility's records show no unusual patterns were flagged. Both men were elderly, both had health conditions that made sudden death seem plausible. This is the insidious nature of healthcare serial killing, it hides within the expected mortality of vulnerable populations. But Wetlaufer wasn't satisfied with her success at Care Sant Care. She was looking for new hunting grounds, new opportunities to exercise her deadly power. In 2012, she began working at Meadow Park Long-Term Care Centre in London, Ontario, expanding her reach and her potential victim pool. The move to Meadow Park represented an escalation in Wetlaufer's criminal behavior. She was no longer content to limit her killing to one facility. She wanted broader access to vulnerable victims, and the healthcare system, with its constant need for qualified nurses, provided her with that access. Gladys Millard, 87 years old, became Wetlaufer's first victim at Meadow Park on October 14, 2012. Like her previous victims, Millard was elderly and vulnerable, dependent on nursing care for her most basic needs. Wetlaufer entered her room during a night shift and administered the fatal insulin injection that would end Millard's life. The pattern was becoming refined. Wetlaufer chose her victims carefully, elderly patients who wouldn't be able to resist or call for help, people whose deaths would seem natural given their age and medical conditions. She attacked during night shifts when there were fewer witnesses and less oversight. And she used insulin, a drug that would be difficult to detect and whose effects could be mistaken for natural medical emergencies. What's particularly disturbing about this phase of her killing spree is the psychological escalation it represents. Wetlaufer was no longer satisfied with killing occasionally. She was developing what can only be described as an appetite for murder. Each successful killing fed a need that required more victims to satisfy. Helen Matheson, 95 years old, became the next victim on December 23, 2012. The timing is particularly cruel. Just days before Christmas, when families were preparing to celebrate, Wetlaufer was taking a life. Matheson died from the insulin injection Wetlaufer administered, another elderly woman whose final moments were spent trusting someone who was actually killing her. The facility staff had no reason to suspect foul play. Both women were very elderly, both had health conditions that made their deaths seem like natural progression of their declining health. The insulin was breaking down in their systems, leaving little trace of the poison that had killed them. By 2013, Elizabeth Wetlaufer had become extremely comfortable with murder. She had killed successfully multiple times without detection, and this success bred a dangerous confidence. She was about to enter the most deadly phase of her killing career. Mary Zurowinski, 96 years old, became another victim at Meadow Park on January 17, 2013. At 96, Zurowinski had lived through nearly a century of history. She had seen the world change in ways that would have been unimaginable in her youth. Her long life was cut short by a nurse who saw her not as a person with a rich history and family who loved her, but as an opportunity to exercise deadly power. The method remained consistent: insulin injection during a night shift, causing hypoglycemia and death. But what was changing was Wetlaufer's psychology. She was becoming more bold, more frequent in her attacks. The gap between murders was shortening. Mathilde Sarin, 91 years old, died on March 27, 2013, another victim of Wetlaufer's insulin injections at Meadow Park. Sarin's death followed the same pattern: an elderly woman, vulnerable and trusting, killed by someone whose job was to protect and care for her. What makes these murders particularly heinous is the violation of trust they represent. These weren't random killings by a stranger in a dark alley. These were intimate betrayals by someone in a position of ultimate trust and authority. The victims couldn't have been more vulnerable, elderly, often confused, dependent on others for their most basic needs. The families of these victims mourned what they believed were natural deaths. They grieved their loved ones while never knowing that those deaths were actually murders. They comforted themselves with the thought that their family members had received good care in their final moments, never suspecting that the care itself had been weaponized against them. In 2014, Wetlaufer temporarily left Meadow Park and returned to work, creating an opportunity for what would become her final confirmed murder at that location. Helen Young, 90 years old, died on July 13, 2013, from an insulin injection administered by Wetlaufer. Young's death completed a deadly pattern at Meadow Park that had claimed the lives of 5 elderly residents. But Wetlaufer wasn't finished. She was about to claim what would be her final murder victim, and she would do so at a different type of facility entirely. In August 2014, Wetlaufer was working at a location that provided her with access to Arpad Horvath, a 75-year-old man who was living at the Meadow Park facility in London, Ontario. Horvath was younger than most of Wetlaufer's previous victims, and he was a married father of 2, making his murder particularly tragic for the family he left behind. On August 31, 2014, Wetlaufer approached Horvath and administered what would be her final fatal insulin injection. Horvath died from the overdose, becoming the 8th and final person Wetlaufer would successfully murder. What makes Horvath's death particularly significant is that it would be the last time Wetlaufer successfully killed someone. Her reign of terror was about to come to an end, though not because she was caught by authorities. Instead, her confession would come from an unexpected source, her own psychological breakdown. Horvath's daughter, Susan, later expressed her horror at learning about the true nature of her father's death. Like all the other families, they had been told nothing suspicious about his passing. They had mourned him believing he died from natural causes, never knowing that a trusted healthcare provider had murdered him. Even after Horvath's murder, Wetlaufer wasn't finished with her deadly activities. She continued to attack patients, but her final attempts would be unsuccessful, serving as attempts to murder rather than completed homicides. In September 2015, while working at Telfer Place Retirement Home in Paris, Ontario, Wetlaufer targeted 77-year-old Sandra Towler. She administered an insulin injection intended to kill Towler, but the attack failed. Towler survived, though she had no idea how close she had come to being murdered by her caregiver. The attack on Towler is significant because it shows that Wetlaufer had not been satisfied with her 8 successful murders. She was continuing to seek new victims, new opportunities to kill. Her appetite for murder hadn't been sated by her previous crimes, if anything, it seemed to be growing. Beverly Bertram, 68 years old, became Wetlaufer's final attempted murder victim in August 2016. Like Towler, Bertram survived the insulin injection that was intended to kill her. She, too, was unaware that her trusted caregiver had tried to murder her. These failed attempts reveal several important aspects of Wetlaufer's psychology. First, she was becoming less careful, perhaps more desperate. The precision that had characterized her earlier murders was beginning to slip. Second, she was expanding her target range. Bertram was younger than most of her previous victims, suggesting that Wetlaufer's criteria for victim selection were broadening. Most importantly, these failed attempts would eventually become crucial evidence in establishing the full scope of Wetlaufer's crimes. When she finally confessed, she wouldn't just admit to the 8 murders, she would also confess to these unsuccessful attempts, providing authorities with a complete picture of her deadly activities. What makes the Elizabeth Wetlaufer case so disturbing isn't just the murders themselves, it's how completely the healthcare system failed to detect them. For 9 years, from 2007 to 2016, Wetlaufer was able to kill and attempt to kill with impunity. Multiple facilities employed her, multiple supervisors worked with her, and multiple regulatory bodies had oversight responsibilities, yet none detected her crimes. The warning signs were there. Wetlaufer had alcohol dependency issues that affected her work performance. She was stealing drugs from her workplace, a clear indication of problems that should have triggered intensive oversight. She had personal relationships that were tumultuous and problematic. Yet somehow, these red flags never translated into the kind of scrutiny that might have prevented her crimes. Perhaps most troubling of all, when Wetlaufer did face employment difficulties, she was actually protected by the very system that should have been protecting patients. The Ontario Nurses Association, her union, provided legal support that helped her avoid termination from at least one position. While unions have an important role in protecting workers' rights, this case illustrates how those protections can sometimes work against patient safety. The insulin monitoring systems at the facilities where Wetlaufer worked were inadequate. Insulin is a controlled substance that should be carefully tracked, yet she was able to access it repeatedly without anyone noticing discrepancies. The lack of proper drug monitoring created opportunities for abuse that Wetlaufer exploited to deadly effect. Shift scheduling also played a role in enabling her crimes. Wetlaufer preferred night shifts, when staffing was lighter and oversight was minimal. This preference should have been seen in conjunction with other warning signs as part of a concerning pattern. Instead, it was accommodated as a reasonable scheduling preference. Elizabeth Wetlaufer's crimes might never have been discovered if not for her own psychological breakdown. In September 2016, she was admitted to the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, CMH, in Toronto, seeking treatment for her substance abuse and psychological problems. It was during this inpatient treatment that something extraordinary happened. Wetlaufer, perhaps overcome by guilt, perhaps seeking some form of psychological relief, perhaps simply unable to bear the weight of her secrets any longer, began to confess her crimes to healthcare providers at the facility. Initially, her confessions were met with disbelief. The idea that a trusted nurse had been systematically murdering patients seemed too horrific to be true. But as Wetlaufer provided more details, including specific information about her victims and methods, it became clear that she was telling the truth about having committed multiple murders. What makes this confession particularly significant is that it was entirely voluntary. Wetlaufer was not under investigation by police. She was not facing any criminal charges. She was not being questioned about suspicious deaths. She confessed purely because of her own psychological need to unburden herself of the terrible secrets she had been carrying. On September 30, 2016, staff at CAMH contacted police to report Wetlaufer's confessions. This began the process that would finally bring her crimes to light and provide justice for her victims and their families. The confession itself was comprehensive. Wetlaufer didn't just admit to 1 or 2 murders, she provided details about 8 killings and 6 attempted murders. She explained her methods, identified her victims, and described the circumstances of each crime. It was a complete accounting of nearly a decade of deadly activity. Once police became involved, they faced the challenging task of investigating murders that had occurred over nearly a decade and had been successfully disguised as natural deaths. The bodies of Wetlaufer's victims had long since been buried or cremated, making forensic evidence difficult to obtain. However, Wetlaufer's cooperation made the investigation somewhat easier. She provided detailed, 2-hour-long confessions to police, walking them through each crime step by step. She explained how she had selected her victims, how she had obtained and administered the insulin, and how she had managed to avoid detection. The police investigation had to reconstruct events that had occurred years earlier. They interviewed facility staff, reviewed medical records, and examined work schedules to corroborate Wetlaufer's confessions. They also had to notify the families of victims, delivering the devastating news that their loved ones had been murdered. For the families, learning the truth about their loved ones' deaths was traumatic. They had to process not only that their family members had been murdered, but that they had been living with incorrect information about those deaths for years. The The natural grieving process had to be reopened and complicated by the knowledge that these weren't natural deaths at all. On October 25, 2016, Elizabeth Wettlaufer was formally charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder, 4 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of aggravated assault. The charges represented the full scope of her criminal activity as detailed in her confessions. The first-degree murder charges were significant because they indicated that police believed Wettlaufer's crimes were premeditated. These weren't impulsive acts or mercy killings, they were planned, deliberate murders that showed clear intent to kill. The legal proceedings moved relatively quickly, largely because of Wettlaufer's cooperation and confession. On June 26, 2017, she appeared in court to enter her plea. In a moment that provided some closure for families and the broader community, she pleaded guilty to all charges. The guilty plea meant there would be no trial, no lengthy proceedings where families would have to relive their trauma, and no possibility that Wettlaufer might escape conviction on technical grounds. She accepted full responsibility for her crimes and the consequences that came with them. The sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for victim impact statements, allowing family members to express the full extent of how Wettlaufer's crimes had affected them. These statements were powerful testimonies to the humanity of the victims and the ripple effects of murder on families and communities. On June 27, 2017, Justice Bruce Thomas sentenced Elizabeth Wettlaufer to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Given her age and the length of the sentence, this essentially guaranteed that she would spend the rest of her life behind bars. The sentence reflected the severity of her crimes and the court's recognition that she posed an ongoing danger to society. The judge noted that her crimes represented a profound violation of trust and that the vulnerable nature of her victims made her actions particularly heinous. But the legal resolution of the case wasn't the end of the story. Questions remained about how the healthcare system had failed so completely to detect her crimes, and there were calls for a comprehensive investigation into those systemic failures. Recognizing that the Wettlaufer case represented a catastrophic failure of the healthcare system, the Ontario government commissioned a public inquiry to examine how she had been able to kill for so long without detection. The inquiry was led by Commissioner Eileen E. Gillese, a retired Court of Appeal judge. The inquiry's mandate was broad: to examine the circumstances that allowed Wettlaufer to commit her crimes, to identify system failures that enabled her activities, and to make recommendations to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The inquiry held extensive hearings, interviewing healthcare workers, administrators, family members, and regulatory officials. It examined policies and procedures at the facilities where Wettlaufer worked, reviewed oversight mechanisms, and analyzed how warning signs had been missed or ignored. One of the inquiry's most damning findings was that if Wettlaufer hadn't confessed, she likely never would have been caught. The system's failure to detect her crimes was so complete that she could have continued killing indefinitely if not for her own psychological breakdown. The inquiry identified multiple points where intervention could have prevented further murders. Better drug monitoring systems, more effective oversight of troubled employees, improved communication between facilities, and enhanced regulatory enforcement all might have stopped Wettlaufer before she claimed 8 lives. On July 31, 2019, Commissioner Gillese released her final report, containing 91 recommendations for improving the safety of long-term care residents. The report was a comprehensive indictment of systemic failures and a roadmap for preventing future tragedies. The recommendations covered areas including drug security and monitoring, staff screening and oversight, facility management practices, regulatory enforcement, and information sharing between healthcare providers. Implementation of these recommendations became a priority for healthcare administrators and government officials. Understanding Elizabeth Wettlaufer's motivations requires examining the psychology of healthcare serial killers, a particularly disturbing category of criminal. These killers exploit the trust and access inherent in medical relationships, using their professional positions to select and kill victims. Healthcare serial killers often share certain characteristics. They may have substance abuse problems, troubled personal relationships, and feelings of powerlessness in their personal lives. The ability to control whether patients live or die can provide a sense of power and control that they lack elsewhere. Wetlaufer's case fits this profile remarkably well. She struggled with alcohol dependency throughout her nursing career. Her personal relationships were troubled and unstable. She was stealing drugs from her workplace, indicating both substance abuse and a willingness to violate professional ethics. The choice of insulin as her weapon was particularly revealing. Insulin overdoses cause hypoglycemia, which can lead to confusion, unconsciousness, and death. The symptoms can easily be mistaken for natural medical emergencies, especially in elderly patients who may have multiple health conditions. More importantly, insulin breaks down quickly in the body, making post-mortem detection extremely difficult. This suggests that Wetlaufer's crimes were not impulsive acts but carefully planned murders designed to avoid detection. Mental health experts who examined the case noted that Wetlaufer's crimes were not mercy killings. Her victims weren't terminally ill patients suffering unbearably. They were simply vulnerable elderly people whose deaths would be less likely to raise suspicions. This indicates that her motivations were psychological rather than compassionate. The escalation in her crimes over time is also characteristic of serial killers. She began with non-fatal assaults, progressed to successful murders, and eventually was attempting to kill more frequently. This pattern suggests that killing became psychologically addictive for her, requiring more frequent acts to satisfy her needs. The Elizabeth Wetlaufer case had implications far beyond the immediate victims and their families. It exposed fundamental weaknesses in Canada's healthcare system and raised questions about patient safety that continue to resonate today. The case highlighted the vulnerability of elderly patients in long-term care facilities. These individuals are often physically and cognitively impaired, making them unable to report abuse or protect themselves from predatory caregivers. They depend entirely on the professional integrity of their caregivers, making them perfect victims for someone like Wetlaufer. The failure of multiple facilities to detect her crimes also revealed problems with healthcare administration and oversight. Drug monitoring systems were inadequate, employee screening was insufficient, and communication between facilities was poor. These systemic failures created an environment where a serial killer could operate with impunity. The case also exposed weaknesses in professional regulation. Despite multiple warning signs, including substance abuse, drug theft, and performance problems, Wetlaufer was able to continue working and was even protected by her professional association when she faced employment difficulties. For families of elderly patients in long-term care, the case created a crisis of confidence. How could they trust that their loved ones were safe when the system had so completely failed to protect Wetlaufer's victims? This erosion of trust has had lasting effects on family relationships with healthcare providers. The broader healthcare community was also affected. The vast majority of nurses and healthcare workers are dedicated professionals who would never harm their patients. But the Wetlaufer case created suspicion and scrutiny that affected all healthcare providers, potentially making their jobs more difficult and stressful. The Elizabeth Wetlaufer case serves as a stark reminder of what can happen when institutional safeguards fail and warning signs are ignored. Her crimes were preventable, not necessarily the first assault, but certainly the escalation to multiple murders over nearly a decade. The case demonstrates the importance of robust drug monitoring systems in healthcare facilities. Controlled substances like insulin must be carefully tracked, with discrepancies immediately investigated. The fact that Wetlaufer was able to access insulin repeatedly without anyone noticing represents a fundamental failure of institutional controls. Employee screening and ongoing monitoring are equally crucial. Healthcare workers with substance abuse problems, performance issues, or concerning behavioral patterns need intensive oversight, not protection from employment consequences. The balance between workers' rights and patient safety must be carefully considered. Information sharing between healthcare facilities is also essential. When healthcare workers move between employers, relevant information about performance problems, disciplinary actions, and concerning behaviors must be communicated to protect patients at their new workplace. The case also highlights the need for family involvement in patient care. While healthcare providers must maintain patient confidentiality, families can serve as additional eyes and ears to detect problems that might otherwise go unnoticed. Their concerns should be taken seriously and thoroughly investigated. Perhaps most importantly, the case demonstrates that healthcare serial killing, while rare, is a real phenomenon that requires specific prevention strategies. The medical community must acknowledge this risk and implement appropriate safeguards, rather than assuming that professional ethics alone are sufficient protection. The implementation of the inquiry's recommendations has been an ongoing process, with healthcare facilities across Ontario and beyond working to strengthen their safeguards against future Elizabeth Wetlaughers. But change is slow, and the vulnerability of elderly patients remains a concern. Amid the focus on Elizabeth Wetlaughers' crimes and the system failures that enabled them, it's important to remember that 8 people lost their lives and 6 others were seriously harmed by her actions. These weren't statistics, they were real people with families, histories, and value beyond measure. James Silcox, 77, was Wetlaughers' first murder victim. He died on August 11, 2011, trusting that the nurse approaching his bedside was there to help him, not kill him. His family mourned what they believed was a natural death, never knowing that he had been murdered. Maurice Granat, 84, died just 6 days later on August 17, 2011. He became another victim of Wetlaughers' deadly ambitions, his life cut short by someone whose job was to protect and care for him. Gladys Millard, 87, was killed on October 14, 2012, when Wetlaughter expanded her killing to a second facility. Millard had lived through 87 years of history, surviving the Great Depression, World War II, and countless other challenges, only to die at the hands of a trusted caregiver. Helen Matheson, 95, died on December 23, 2012, just days before Christmas. Her family spent that holiday season grieving her loss, never suspecting that her death was actually murder. Mary Zurowinski, 96, was killed on January 17, 2013. At 96, she had lived nearly a full century, experiencing changes in the world that would have been unimaginable in her youth. Her remarkable longevity was ended by a nurse who saw her only as a victim. Mathilde Sarin, 91, died on March 27, 2013, another elderly woman whose trust was fatally betrayed by someone in a position of authority and care. Helen Young, 90, was killed on July 13, 2013, completing a deadly pattern at one facility that claimed multiple lives over several years. Arpad Horvath, 75, was Wetlaughers' final murder victim, dying on August 31, 2014. He was a married father of 2, whose death devastated a family that had no idea he had been murdered. These 8 individuals deserved to live out their natural lives in dignity and peace. Instead, they became victims of someone who exploited their vulnerability and trust. Their murders represent not just individual tragedies, but a collective failure to protect those who needed protection most. The survivors of Wetlaughers' attempted murders, including Sandra Towler and Beverly Bertram, also deserve recognition. They survived attacks that were intended to kill them, though they were unaware at the time of how close they came to death. Their survival was a matter of chance, not because Wetlaughers' intent was any less murderous. The story of Elizabeth Wetlaughter is one of the most disturbing cases of healthcare serial killing in Canadian history. Over the course of nearly a decade, she systematically murdered 8 vulnerable elderly patients and attempted to kill 6 others, using her position as a trusted nurse to access and attack her victims. What makes her case particularly chilling is not just the number of her victims, but the complete failure of the healthcare system to detect her crimes. Multiple facilities employed her, multiple supervisors worked with her, and multiple regulatory bodies had oversight responsibilities, yet she was able to kill with impunity until her own confession brought her crimes to light. The case exposed fundamental weaknesses in Canada's healthcare system: inadequate drug monitoring, insufficient employee screening, poor communication between facilities, and weak regulatory enforcement. These systemic failures created an environment where a predatory killer could operate undetected for years. The public inquiry that followed Wetlaufer's conviction made 91 recommendations for improving patient safety and preventing similar tragedies. Implementation of these recommendations is ongoing, but change is slow, and the vulnerability of elderly patients in long-term care remains a significant concern. For the families of Wetlaufer's victims, the case brought both justice and additional trauma. They finally learned the truth about their loved ones' deaths, but they also had to process the devastating knowledge that those they had trusted to provide care had instead provided murder. The broader impact of the case continues to reverberate through Canada's healthcare system. It serves as a stark reminder of what can happen when institutional safeguards fail and warning signs are ignored. It demonstrates the need for constant vigilance in protecting vulnerable patients from those who would exploit their trust. Elizabeth Wetlaufer herself remains imprisoned, serving a life sentence with no possibility of parole for 25 years. At her age, this sentence effectively means she will spend the rest of her life behind bars, unable to harm any more patients. But her legacy extends far beyond her individual crimes. The case she created has fundamentally changed how healthcare institutions think about patient safety, employee monitoring, and the prevention of healthcare serial killing. Her name has become synonymous with the darkest possible betrayal of medical trust. The 8 people she killed, James Silcox, Maurice Granat, Gladys Millard, Helen Matheson, Mary Zurawinski, Mathilde Sarin, Helen Young, and Arpit Horvath, deserved better. They deserved to live out their natural lives in peace and dignity. Instead, they became victims of someone who exploited their vulnerability for reasons that may never be fully understood. Their deaths were not in vain if the lessons learned from this case prevent future tragedies. The reforms implemented in response to Wetlaufer's crimes may protect future patients from similar predators. The increased awareness of healthcare serial killing may help identify warning signs before other potential killers can claim victims. In the end, the Elizabeth Wetlaufer case stands as both a horror story and a call to action. It reminds us that evil can hide behind a professional facade, that trust can be weaponized against the vulnerable, and that systems designed to protect can fail catastrophically. But it also demonstrates that even the darkest crimes can eventually come to light. I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our 4th story. Story 4. In the bustling city of Denver, Colorado, where the Rocky Mountains provide a stunning backdrop to urban life, there lived a man who seemed to have it all. Dr. Stephen Matthews was a successful cardiologist, a healer of hearts in the most literal sense. By day, he wore crisp white coats and saved lives. By night, however, he led an entirely different existence, one that would eventually crumble under the weight of his own twisted desires and calculated cruelty. This is a story about deception, about trust violated in the most heinous ways possible, and about the brave women who found the courage to speak their truth. It's a story that unfolded not in the shadowy alleyways of crime dramas, but in the seemingly innocent world of modern dating, where swipes right and left determine romantic fate. Tonight, we'll journey through the methodical investigation that brought down a predator hiding in plain sight, examining each thread that prosecutors carefully wove together to reveal a pattern of systematic abuse that spanned years. The case of Stephen Matthews serves as a chilling reminder that monsters don't always lurk in dark corners, sometimes they wear stethoscopes and have medical degrees. Stephen Matthews appeared to be the epitome of success in early 2023. At 36 years old, he had built what many would consider an enviable life in Denver. His medical practice thrived, his colleagues respected him, and to the outside world, he represented everything that society values: education, professional achievement, and the noble calling of medicine. Matthews lived in a well-appointed townhouse in West Denver, the kind of place that speaks of professional success without being ostentatious. The interior was tastefully decorated, designed to impress without overwhelming, the perfect setting for what he told potential romantic partners were intimate dinner dates. His home became a stage, carefully set for performances that would have horrific consequences. On dating apps like Hinge, Tinder, and Match, Matthews crafted a persona that was almost irresistible to many women. His profile showcased his medical credentials, his apparent sophistication, and his seeming emotional availability. He understood instinctively that in the world of online dating, first impressions matter enormously. His photos were carefully chosen, his profile text thoughtfully written to appeal to women seeking serious relationships. What made Matthews particularly dangerous was his patience. This wasn't a man who acted on impulse or let emotion cloud his judgment. Instead, investigators would later discover that he operated with the methodical precision one might expect from someone trained in the exacting science of cardiology. Every interaction was calculated, every invitation carefully timed, every environment meticulously prepared. The women who matched with him on these platforms saw exactly what he wanted them to see: a successful, attractive professional who seemed genuinely interested in getting to know them. He asked thoughtful questions, remembered details from their conversations, and presented himself as someone seeking meaningful connection. In a dating landscape often characterized by superficial interactions and casual hookups, Matthews appeared to offer something different: depth, stability, and genuine romantic interest. What investigators would eventually piece together was a pattern of behavior that was both systematic and terrifyingly consistent. Matthews didn't select his victims randomly, he showed preferences that revealed the calculated nature of his crimes. He seemed particularly drawn to women who were new to the Denver area, perhaps sensing that those without strong local support networks might be more vulnerable. His approach was refined through repetition. The initial conversations would be charming and intellectually engaging. He would suggest meeting for brunch or casual dates, activities that seemed safe and public. These early encounters served a dual purpose: they allowed Matthews to assess his potential victims while simultaneously building trust. He understood that women would naturally be cautious about meeting strangers from dating apps, so he invested time in appearing completely trustworthy. The transition from public meetings to private encounters was always gradual. Matthews never rushed this process, instead allowing each relationship to develop at what seemed like a natural pace. When he finally invited women to his townhouse, it felt like a logical progression rather than a red flag. He would suggest cooking dinner together or watching movies, activities that seemed intimate but not immediately threatening. His home was prepared like a spider's web. Everything appeared normal, even inviting, but it was designed to facilitate his crimes. The layout, the atmosphere, even the choice of what to serve his guests, everything served his ultimate purpose. Matthews had learned to weaponize hospitality, turning the universal human desire for connection and intimacy against those who trusted him. The sophistication of his operation extended to his preparation of substances used to incapacitate his victims. Investigators never determined exactly what Matthews used to drug his victims, but the effects were consistent. Women would experience memory loss, disorientation, and physical helplessness. The fact that he was a medical professional gave him both the knowledge and access necessary to obtain and use such substances effectively. The case that would ultimately bring down Stephen Matthews began with extraordinary courage from a single woman who decided that her silence was more dangerous than her fear. In March 2023, one of his victims made the decision to report what had happened to her to the Denver Police Department. Her story was both heartbreaking and familiar to investigators who work these types of cases. She had met Matthews on a dating app, been charmed by his apparent sincerity and professional success, and agreed to meet him for brunch. That initial meeting had gone well, so well that she felt comfortable accepting his invitation to his home for dinner. What she remembered of that evening was fragmented, like trying to piece together a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. She recalled arriving at his townhouse, remembered having a drink, and then, nothing. The next clear memory she had was waking up in an unfamiliar place, feeling disoriented and violated, with the unmistakable sense that something terrible had happened to her. The physical evidence of assault was undeniable, but like many victims of drug-facilitated sexual assault, she struggled with the gaps in her memory. This is one of the cruelest aspects of these crimes. Victims are left to piece together fragments of recollection while dealing with the trauma of what they know occurred during the lost hours. What made her decision to report particularly brave was the knowledge that she would be going up against a respected medical professional. Matthews wasn't some obvious criminal, he was exactly the kind of person that society typically believes and defends. Her decision to speak out required her to risk public scrutiny, professional judgment, and the possibility that she might not be believed. The Denver Police Department took her report seriously, but investigators knew that prosecuting a case like this would require extraordinary evidence. Drug-facilitated sexual assault cases are notoriously difficult to prove in court, particularly when the defendant is a professional with no prior criminal record and significant community standing. Detective work in cases involving drug-facilitated sexual assault requires a particular kind of patience and methodology. The Denver Police Department's investigators, led by seasoned detectives experienced in sex crimes, understood that if Matthews had victimized one woman in this manner, there were likely others. The initial investigation focused on building a timeline of Matthews' activities and identifying patterns that might reveal additional victims. Investigators obtained warrants for his electronic devices, social media accounts, and dating app activities. What they discovered was both more extensive and more disturbing than they had initially suspected. Matthews' phone revealed a digital trail of communications with dozens of women across multiple dating platforms. The volume of his activity was staggering. He was essentially operating what amounted to a full-time predatory operation while maintaining his medical practice. His messages showed a consistent pattern of behavior: initial charm, gradual escalation to in-person meetings, and eventually invitations to his home. Even more troubling was what investigators found in his deleted files and attempted data destruction. Prosecutors would later reveal that Matthews had tried to scrub evidence from his phone, including text conversations and videos involving some of his victims. The technical analysis of his devices revealed attempts to permanently delete material that would have been crucial evidence in establishing his pattern of behavior. The investigation team made a strategic decision that would prove crucial to the case's success. They decided to make Matthews' arrest public, hoping that the publicity would encourage other potential victims to come forward. This approach is always risky in sexual assault cases, as it can lead to false allegations or public speculation that makes prosecution more difficult. However, the investigators believed that the pattern they were seeing suggested multiple victims who might not have reported their experiences. The decision to publicize Matthews' arrest proved to be a turning point in the case. Within weeks of the news breaking, 9 additional women contacted the Denver Police Department with remarkably similar stories. Each account followed the same basic pattern: meeting Matthews on a dating app, being charmed by his professional status and apparent sincerity, agreeing to meet him privately, and then experiencing memory loss and evidence of sexual assault. The consistency of these accounts was both heartbreaking and legally powerful. Each woman described similar experiences: the careful courtship, the invitation to his home, the offering of drinks, and then the terrifying blank space where their memories should have been. Many described waking up in states of undress, with clear physical evidence of assault, but with no memory of how they had gotten to that point. What made these cases particularly tragic was the long-term impact on the victims. Several women described how the experience had affected their ability to trust, to form relationships, and to feel safe in their own bodies. The loss of memory, rather than being a mercy, became an additional source of trauma. They knew something terrible had happened but couldn't fully remember what they had endured. The investigators worked carefully with each victim, understanding that the process of reporting and reliving these experiences was traumatizing in itself. Victim advocates were brought in to provide support, and prosecutors worked to ensure that the legal process would be as minimally traumatic as possible while still building the strongest possible case. As more women came forward, a clearer picture emerged of Matthews' methods. He had refined his approach over time, learning from each encounter to become more effective at avoiding detection. His medical background gave him advantages that ordinary criminals wouldn't have. He understood how drugs affected the human body, how to calculate dosages, and how to minimize physical evidence of his crimes. Modern criminal investigations increasingly rely on digital forensics, and the Matthews case was no exception. His electronic devices contained a treasure trove of evidence that helped prosecutors establish both his pattern of behavior and his intent to commit these crimes. Matthews' dating app activity revealed an almost industrial level of operation. He was simultaneously pursuing dozens of women across multiple platforms, maintaining separate conversations and persona adjustments based on what he learned about each potential victim. His messages showed a sophisticated understanding of manipulation psychology. He knew exactly what to say to build trust and overcome natural caution. The technical analysis of his phone revealed not just the communications themselves, but also his attempts to hide his activities. Digital forensics experts were able to recover deleted messages, photos, and even some video files that Matthews had attempted to permanently erase. These recovered files provided crucial evidence of his crimes and his awareness of their illegality. Particularly damning was evidence that Matthews had researched methods of data destruction and had attempted to use sophisticated techniques to hide his digital tracks. This wasn't the behavior of someone who believed his actions were legal or appropriate. It was the careful planning of someone who understood the criminal nature of his conduct and was actively working to avoid detection. The investigators also discovered that Matthews had used his medical knowledge to research the substances he was using to incapacitate his victims. His search history revealed queries about drug interactions, dosages, and effects that directly correlated with the symptoms his victims had experienced. This evidence was crucial in establishing not just what he had done, but his deliberate planning and medical sophistication in carrying out these crimes. As the investigation expanded, it became clear that Matthews' professional status had been both a tool for his crimes and ultimately a factor in his downfall. His medical credentials had given him credibility with victims and access to substances and knowledge that ordinary criminals wouldn't possess. However, his professional life also created a digital and professional trail that investigators could follow. The medical community's response to Matthews' arrest was swift and decisive. His medical license was suspended, and his colleagues began to distance themselves from him professionally. The hospital systems where he had worked initiated their own internal investigations to determine if there had been any warning signs of his behavior that had been missed. This aspect of the case highlights a disturbing reality about professional predators. Their credentials and social status often provide them with both opportunity and protection. Victims are less likely to report crimes committed by respected professionals, and when they do report, they're often met with skepticism. Matthews had exploited this dynamic, using his medical degree as both a tool for gaining trust and a shield against suspicion. The investigation revealed that Matthews had compartmentalized his life with remarkable efficiency. His colleagues saw him as a competent, professional physician. His victims saw him as a charming, successful potential romantic partner. Neither group had any indication of the other side of his personality until the investigation brought his double life into the open. Prosecuting Stephen Matthews required assembling a complex legal strategy that could overcome several significant challenges. Drug-facilitated sexual assault cases are among the most difficult to prosecute successfully, particularly when the defendant has no prior criminal record and significant social standing. The prosecution team, led by experienced sex crimes prosecutors, understood that they would need to establish a clear pattern of behavior across multiple victims to overcome the individual weaknesses in each case. While any single incident might be subject to reasonable doubt, the consistency across multiple unrelated victims created a powerful narrative of systematic predatory behavior. The prosecutors faced the challenge of presenting evidence that was often fragmentary due to the nature of the crimes. Victims' memories were incomplete, physical evidence was limited, and much of the most damning evidence was circumstantial. However, the digital evidence from Matthews' devices provided a crucial foundation that corroborated the victims' accounts. The legal team also had to navigate the sensitive issue of victim testimony. Each woman would need to testify about deeply traumatic experiences while being cross-examined by defense attorneys whose job was to create reasonable doubt. The prosecution worked carefully with victim advocates to prepare the women for this process while protecting their psychological well-being as much as possible. One of the prosecution's strengths was the ability to present expert testimony about drug-facilitated sexual assault. Medical experts could explain to the jury how the substances Matthews used would affect his victims, why their memories were fragmented, and how his medical training would have given him the knowledge to carry out these crimes effectively. The trial of Stephen Matthews began on July 15, 2024, in Denver District Court, drawing significant media attention and public interest. The case had become a symbol of the dangers inherent in modern dating and the particular vulnerabilities that women face when meeting strangers through online platforms. Judge Eric Johnson presided over the proceedings, which would ultimately involve testimony from multiple victims, expert witnesses, and extensive presentation of digital evidence. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, with the weight of the allegations and the number of victims creating an emotionally charged environment. In her opening statement, Prosecutor Bree Beasley painted a picture of Matthews as a calculating predator who had developed a systematic, deliberate pattern of finding and victimizing women through dating apps. She described how he had used his professional credentials and apparent respectability to gain access to victims, then used his medical knowledge to facilitate his crimes. The prosecution's opening focused on the consistency of Matthews' methods across multiple victims. Beasley explained to the jury how each woman's experience followed the same basic pattern: the online courtship, the careful building of trust, the invitation to his home, and then the drug-facilitated assault. She emphasized that these weren't random encounters gone wrong, but carefully planned crimes carried out by someone who understood exactly what he was doing. The defense team faced the challenging task of defending a client whose alleged crimes involved multiple victims with remarkably similar stories. Their strategy focused on challenging the reliability of the victims' memories, questioning the forensic evidence, and arguing that the sexual encounters were consensual. However, the volume and consistency of the evidence made this a difficult argument to sustain. The most powerful and emotionally difficult part of the trial was the testimony of Matthews' victims. One by one, the women took the stand to describe their experiences, often struggling with the gaps in their memories while dealing with the trauma of reliving these events in a public forum. Each victim's testimony followed similar patterns but included unique details that helped establish the credibility of their accounts. They described the careful courtship process, the apparent sincerity of Matthews' interest in them, and their decision to trust him based on his professional status and charming personality. The testimony about the assaults themselves was necessarily fragmentary, as the effects of whatever substance Matthews had used to incapacitate his victims had left them with incomplete memories. However, this fragmentation itself became evidence of the crimes. Expert witnesses explained to the jury that these memory gaps were consistent with drug-facilitated sexual assault. Many of the victims testified about the long-term impact of their experiences. They described how the assaults had affected their ability to trust, their relationships with friends and family, and their overall sense of safety in the world. Several spoke about the additional trauma of not being able to fully remember what had happened to them, leaving them with a sense of violation without complete knowledge of what they had endured. The courage required for these women to testify cannot be overstated. They were forced to relive traumatic experiences in a public forum, subject to cross-examination by defense attorneys whose job was to challenge their credibility and memory. Their willingness to speak out despite these challenges was crucial to the case's ultimate success. The prosecution's presentation of digital evidence was methodical and damning. Forensic experts walked the jury through Matthews' electronic devices, showing the extensive communications with potential victims across multiple dating platforms and the evidence of his attempts to destroy incriminating material. The recovered text messages revealed Matthews' sophisticated approach to manipulation. He tailored his communications to each victim, presenting different aspects of his personality based on what he learned about their interests and vulnerabilities. The messages showed a pattern of gradually building trust and moving relationships from public meetings to private encounters at his home. Perhaps most disturbing were the recovered files that Matthews had attempted to delete. These included communications with victims, photos, and even some video material that provided direct evidence of his crimes. The technical testimony about his attempts to permanently erase this evidence showed consciousness of guilt and understanding of the criminal nature of his actions. The prosecution also presented evidence of Matthews' research into data destruction techniques and his systematic attempts to cover his tracks. This wasn't someone who had committed crimes in the heat of passion. This was careful, premeditated behavior by someone who understood the legal consequences of his actions and was actively working to avoid them. The trial featured extensive expert testimony from medical professionals, forensic experts, and specialists in sexual assault cases. These witnesses provided crucial context that helped the jury understand the technical aspects of the crimes and their impact on the victims. Medical experts testified about the effects of the substances Matthews used to incapacitate his victims. They explained how these drugs would affect memory formation, physical coordination, and the ability to consent to sexual activity. This testimony was crucial in helping the jury understand why the victims' memories were fragmented and why they had been unable to resist or escape from the situations. Forensic experts presented the digital evidence in detail, explaining how they had recovered deleted files and traced Matthews' online activities. Their testimony showed the jury the extent of Matthews' predatory behavior and his efforts to hide evidence of his crimes. Sexual assault experts testified about the dynamics of drug-facilitated sexual assault and the common responses of victims to these crimes. This testimony helped contextualize the victims' experiences and responses, explaining why they had reacted in certain ways and why their memories of the events were incomplete. Matthews' defense team faced the challenging task of defending against multiple, consistent allegations from unrelated victims. Their primary strategy focused on challenging the reliability of the victims' memories and arguing that the sexual encounters had been consensual. The defense argued that the victims' memory gaps could be explained by voluntary alcohol consumption rather than involuntary drugging. They questioned the timing of the reports and suggested that the women had participated willingly in sexual encounters but had later regretted their decisions. However, this strategy faced significant obstacles. The consistency of the victims' accounts across multiple unrelated women made it difficult to argue that all of them had misremembered or mischaracterized their experiences. The digital evidence showing Matthews' systematic approach to meeting and isolating victims contradicted the argument that these were spontaneous, consensual encounters. The defense also struggled with the evidence of Matthews' attempts to destroy digital evidence. If the encounters had been consensual, there would have been no reason for him to systematically delete communications and files related to his interactions with these women. After several days of deliberation, the jury returned with verdicts that reflected the strength of the prosecution's case. Matthews was found guilty on 35 of the 38 counts against him, including multiple charges of sexual assault and drug-related offenses. The verdict represented a vindication for the victims who had courageously come forward to testify. It also sent a clear message that professional status and social standing would not protect predators from the consequences of their actions. The guilty verdicts covered assaults against multiple victims and included charges related to the use of drugs to facilitate sexual assault. The jury's decision to convict on the vast majority of charges showed that they had found the prosecution's evidence compelling and credible. For the victims, the verdict provided a measure of justice, though it could never fully repair the damage that had been done to their lives. Many spoke about the relief of being believed and having their experiences validated through the legal process. On October 25, 2024, Stephen Matthews appeared before Judge Eric Johnson for sentencing. The courtroom was filled with victims, their supporters, and members of the community who had followed the case closely. Judge Johnson sentenced Matthews to 158 years in prison, the maximum sentence possible under the law. In delivering the sentence, the judge spoke directly about the pain that Matthews had caused his victims and the calculated nature of his crimes. "I'm never going to be able to remember, but I'm also never going to be able to forget," one victim told the court during the sentencing hearing, capturing the lasting impact of Matthews' crimes. "In here today, there is a room full of pain," Judge Johnson said. "And this is pain that you caused your victims." The sentence effectively ensures that Matthews will spend the rest of his life in prison. At 36 years old, he will be eligible for parole only after serving the vast majority of his sentence, making it highly unlikely that he will ever be released. The sentencing hearing featured powerful victim impact statements from the women Matthews had assaulted. These statements provided insight into the long-term consequences of his crimes and the strength of the survivors who had come forward. Many of the victims spoke about how Matthews' actions had affected their ability to trust others and form healthy relationships. They described the ongoing trauma of living with fragmented memories of their assaults and the challenge of rebuilding their sense of safety and self-worth. "I let your actions eat me alive for years," one victim said during the sentencing. Her words captured the long-term psychological impact that Matthews' crimes had inflicted on his victims, damage that would extend far beyond the legal proceedings. The victims also spoke about the courage required to come forward and participate in the legal process. Many acknowledged that their decision to testify had been difficult but necessary, both for their own healing and to prevent Matthews from victimizing other women. The Stephen Matthews case has had implications that extend far beyond the individual crimes and victims involved. It has highlighted the particular vulnerabilities that exist in modern dating, especially when conducted through online platforms that provide limited verification of users' identities or intentions. The case has prompted discussions about safety measures that dating apps might implement to better protect their users. While no system can completely eliminate the risk of predatory behavior, the Matthews case has shown how professional credentials and social status can be weaponized by those with criminal intent. Law enforcement agencies have also learned from the investigation, particularly regarding the importance of digital forensics in sexual assault cases and the need for specialized training in handling drug-facilitated sexual assault cases. The courage shown by Matthews' victims in coming forward has been recognized as crucial not only to securing justice in this case but also to encouraging other victims of similar crimes to report their experiences. The Stephen Matthews case serves as a stark reminder that predators can hide behind respectable facades and professional credentials. His success as a cardiologist provided him with both the knowledge to carry out sophisticated crimes and the social standing to avoid suspicion. The case highlights the importance of believing victims when they report sexual assault, particularly in cases involving drugs that affect memory. The fragmented nature of the victims' memories, rather than undermining their credibility, was actually evidence of the crimes themselves. It also demonstrates the power of multiple victims coming forward with similar stories. While any individual case might be subject to reasonable doubt, the pattern of behavior across multiple unrelated victims created a compelling narrative that the jury found convincing. The Denver Police Department's handling of the Matthews investigation provides a model for how law enforcement can effectively pursue complex sexual assault cases involving professional defendants and digital evidence. The decision to publicize Matthews' arrest was crucial in encouraging additional victims to come forward. While this approach carries risks, in this case it was essential to building a comprehensive case that could overcome the challenges inherent in prosecuting drug-facilitated sexual assault. The thorough digital forensics investigation was also crucial. Matthews' attempts to destroy evidence actually provided additional proof of his guilt, as the technical analysis revealed both the original criminal communications and his efforts to hide them. The collaboration between investigators, prosecutors, and victim advocates ensured that the legal process was as supportive as possible for the victims while still building the strongest possible case for prosecution. The Matthews case raises important questions about professional oversight and the responsibility of professional organizations to monitor their members for signs of concerning behavior. While Matthews had no prior criminal record that would have raised red flags, the case highlights the importance of robust professional ethics standards and the need for colleagues and institutions to be vigilant for signs of inappropriate behavior. The swift action by medical licensing boards and healthcare institutions to distance themselves from Matthews after his arrest shows the seriousness with which the medical community treats violations of professional ethics and criminal behavior. Matthews' use of dating apps to find victims represents a modern evolution of predatory behavior. His ability to simultaneously pursue dozens of potential victims across multiple platforms gave him advantages that predators of earlier generations wouldn't have had. The digital evidence from his devices provided crucial proof of his systematic approach, but it also raises questions about privacy and the digital trails that modern technology creates. In this case, Matthews' own devices became the key evidence used to convict him. The case demonstrates both the vulnerabilities and the investigative advantages created by modern technology. While dating apps provided Matthews with access to victims, they also created a digital record that ultimately helped secure his conviction. Throughout the trial and its aftermath, the resilience and courage of Matthews' victims have been remarkable. Despite the trauma they experienced and the challenges of participating in a highly publicized legal proceeding, they found the strength to seek justice. Many of the victims have spoken about their ongoing recovery process and their commitment to helping other survivors of similar crimes. Their advocacy work has helped raise awareness about drug-facilitated sexual assault and the particular challenges faced by victims of these crimes. The support systems that developed around the victims, including victim advocates, counselors, and community organizations, demonstrate the importance of comprehensive support for sexual assault survivors throughout the legal process and beyond. As we reach the end of this disturbing but important story, it's worth reflecting on what the case of Stephen Matthews tells us about justice, courage, and the hidden dangers that can lurk behind respectable facades. Stephen Matthews was sentenced to 158 years in prison for his systematic campaign of drugging and sexually assaulting women he met through dating apps. His conviction represents justice for his victims, but it also serves as a warning about the vulnerabilities inherent in modern dating and the particular dangers posed by predators who exploit professional credibility. The courage shown by the women who came forward to report these crimes cannot be overstated. In speaking out against a respected medical professional, they risked public scrutiny and legal challenges while dealing with the trauma of their experiences. Their willingness to testify was crucial not only to securing Matthews' conviction but also to preventing him from victimizing additional women. The case demonstrates the importance of believing victims, supporting survivors, and maintaining vigilance against those who would exploit positions of trust and authority for criminal purposes. It also shows the power of thorough investigation and the role that digital evidence plays in modern criminal justice. For those listening tonight, the story of Stephen Matthews serves as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the resilience of survivors. It reminds us that justice, while sometimes slow and difficult to achieve, remains possible when victims find the courage to speak and society chooses to listen. The women who survived Stephen Matthews' crimes have reclaimed their voices and their power. Their strength in the face of unimaginable violation stands as a beacon of hope for other survivors and a reminder that even the most careful predators can be brought to justice when their victims refuse to remain silent. As we close this chapter on the crimes of Stephen Matthews, we honor the courage of those who spoke truth to power and helped ensure that a dangerous predator will never again have the opportunity to harm innocent women. Their bravery has made the world a safer place, and their voices will continue to resonate long after the courtroom doors have closed. In the quiet hours of the night, as you drift toward sleep, remember that justice, though sometimes delayed, can still prevail when good people refuse to look away from difficult truths. The story of Stephen Matthews is ultimately not just about the crimes he committed, but about the courage of those who ensured he would face the consequences of his actions. Sweet dreams, and may this story remind us all of the importance of believing survivors, supporting justice, and never underestimating the power of truth to overcome even the most carefully constructed lies. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.